Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, President Trump's ultimatum to Iran: open the Strait of Hormuz or the United States will strike power plants. The timeline and how Iran is responding.
And the president says he's ready to deploy ICE agents to airports by tomorrow if Democrats don't agree to parts of a Homeland Security funding plan.
Negotiate with Republicans, but at the same time, don't inflict pain on the American people.
The latest as security delays plague airport travelers.
Plus, take us out to the ball game.
It comes down to a few things. It comes down to great pitching, good defense, situational hitting.
We talked to Alex Rodriguez ahead of opening day about baseball and business.
Learning from your mistakes and then being able to play offense in the future has worked well for me.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, March 22nd. We've got a lot of news ahead for all our listeners and viewers across all of our platforms: radio, TV, streaming, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
We are here every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And Christina, we saw more missiles being traded back and forth between Israel and Iran overnight, this conflict continuing to widen. I'm old enough to remember when President Trump said this might be winding down.
Correct. We had a big hit overnight in Israel, something we're going to talk to our reporters about this morning. It looks like there were casualties, and our Mideast reporters are seeing signs of some smoke rising above places in Tehran as we come on the air this morning. So lots to get to.
Let's get to the headlines first with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
Yeah, a lot of action from President Donald Trump. He's given Iran an ultimatum if Tehran doesn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It came in a social media post that was about 7:44 p.m. Eastern time last night. The president said Iran has 48 hours to fully open the waterway without threat. If not, he said the U.S. would, quote, hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Now, Iranian media reports Tehran will strike U.S. infrastructure in the region if its plans are hit. Well, the conflict has resulted in over 4,000 deaths, a surge in oil and natural gas prices. More than 150 people were injured in Israel on Saturday by multiple Iranian strikes in the country's south as Tehran retaliated for an attack on its own nuclear facility. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said the joint campaign would intensify significantly a day after Tehran launched ballistic missiles at the U.S.-UK military base in Diego Garcia, nearly 2,500 miles away from Iran. Well, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was on the Hill for a rare Saturday session. He was slamming GOP lawmakers for not coming to an agreement to fund the DHS and get the TSA back to work and paid.
So today, Democrats offer to pay TSA without the anchor of demanding funding of ICE and CPB without any guardrails, which is what the Republicans are doing. We want to open TSA with no strings attached. Let me repeat, no strings attached. There's not one bill the Republicans have brought forward that doesn't have strings attached.
And Majority Leader John Thune, he responded at a press conference yesterday.
So the opportunity to actually drive this to a conclusion is there. You have to have, obviously, to negotiate a deal, you got to have two sides at the table. The White House is there, Senate Republicans are there. The question is, are Senate Democrats going to take yes for an answer? And frankly, at some point it's going to become pretty clear to everybody that they really don't have any excuses.
TSA workers have been without pay for 5 weeks, pushing some to call in sick, and that's led to long delays, major airports during the busy spring break season. President Trump now threatening to send ICE agents to U.S. airports as soon as Monday if Democrats don't agree to a funding plan. He said they would not only assist in security, but also arrest anyone suspected of immigrating illegally to the U.S. And former FBI Director and Special Counsel Robert Mueller has died at the age of 81. He oversaw the landmark investigation into alleged camp ties between the Russian government and President Trump's 2016 campaign. Now, the president posted on social media minutes after the passing was announced, saying, Robert Mueller just died. Good. I'm glad he's dead. He can no longer hurt innocent people. And, of course, the president's response drawing some criticism, David and Christina, from Republicans and both Democrats alike.
We could spend an hour on that tweet,
Yes.
but we're not going to do that.
Not one to mince words, but even that was forceful from the president. He was very active on social media overnight.
And we're going to get to a lot of that here over the course of the next hour. The clock is ticking on President Trump's ultimatum on the Strait of Hormuz. There were just 36 hours until Iran must open up that strait, or as the president put it, have its power plants, quote, obliterated. I should note this is a stark difference to what the president said on Friday.
We don't use the strait. The United States. We don't need it. Europe needs it. Korea, Japan, China, a lot of other people. So they'll have to get involved a little bit on that one. You know, at a certain point, it'll open itself. At a certain point.
All right, joining us now to break this all down, we've got Ethan Bronner. He's Bloomberg's Israel bureau chief. He's in Tel Aviv. Philip Crowther, he's the AP international correspondent. He's joining us from Dubai. And Skylar Woodhouse, our White House reporter, is here with us on set. Ethan, I think we want to start with you because we have this statement from the head of the IDF saying that the war is at its halfway point. That doesn't exactly go in line with what the White House has been saying. But what does that mean for a timeline? Are we talking possibly 2 to 4 more weeks here?
I think we are. I mean, it's interesting that you take one statement by the president and describe it as what the White House is saying. As you've been saying yourselves, he says different things every day. I mean, just a few days ago, he said, we must not hit power plants. Israel must not do that again. We're opposed to that. Last night, he says we're going to do it in 48 hours. So, you know, I mean, this is part of who President Trump is. I would say that generally, they've talked about a 4 to 6 week event. We're 3 weeks in. The Israelis are saying we're halfway there. That is what they're saying. Obviously, they will do what the president says. My instinct is he will not stop the war soon, that we probably do have 3 more weeks easily.
Skylar, pick up on that, if you would, the very good point that Ethan's making, which is, yes, the president is the commander-in-chief, the leader of the free world, all of that. But there is this chorus of discord among his advisors, and we've heard mixed messages from them and indeed from him himself.
Totally. I mean, this is a striking change from Friday and what we were discussing yesterday. But I do think it plays in part a little bit to what we were getting at yesterday, and that the president really goes back and forth and sort of changes his mind. I mean, he likes to keep people guessing. He was obviously saying that the war is winding down, and now he's hitting with a pretty intense threat. So it will be a very interesting rest of today and week. And I just want to note, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, look, President Trump, this war, Bloomberg colleagues were reporting that Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a more muted tone to this war, and Trump was really, outside advisors were kind of pushing him or urging him to maybe go forward with this war. And you had media mogul Rupert Murdoch even in Trump's ear over this war that has now begun. So it's very fascinating, which is, showing that Trump is really the deciding factor here. Obviously, he has advisors, national security advisors, but it's tricky because they can advise Trump all day long, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get in his ear and get him to change his mind.
He's got to make the decision. Philip, I want to go to you because speaking of maybe not mixed but conflicting messages, we have this threat from the president saying if Iran doesn't open the strait in 48 hours, he's going to take action against the energy grid. In contrast, Iran has come out with a statement saying it is open to all but Iran's enemies. And I'm wondering, since you've just come back from the Strait and you're very dialed in this region, is there any discussion or any possibility that some of these Gulf nations part ways with the U.S. and try to engage Iran to negotiate passage for their vessels alone to try to get through the Strait before any of this happens?
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. Essentially, what we're seeing here is Iran is encouraging countries to come to it and talk about how they might get safe passage. It would appear that that might mean also paying a pretty heavy fee per ship to go through the Strait of Hormuz. These are Iran's rules right now. Iran clearly has control over the Strait of Hormuz and decides what happens there. Now, remember, of course, that the idea that President Trump had to put together an international coalition of warships that would escort them in and out of the Persian Gulf, that has not come to be. Hence this ultimatum and many other smaller deals that are essentially being made. The latest one between Iran and Japan. Japan might be able to get oil in and out of the Persian Gulf to Japan, of course, most notably, but remember that a very large percentage of the oil that comes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia, and a large percentage thereof goes to China. Other countries have also made deals, the likes of India and Pakistan, on a case-by-case basis, essentially. And yes, you're right, Iran has reacted to this and basically said, well, the Strait of Hormuz is open, but not to you guys. It's open to everybody except any ship that might be affiliated or linked to the United States or Israel, or any of their allies. That is quite a big group of countries right there. But just one note on this ultimatum. Now, the problem with this is it is an ultimatum, and that means that when was this published? Probably about 8 hours ago, and now we're in the 36
somewhere in the 30s,
stretch,
yeah,
more or less. And what this means is the United States is going to be in a key moment here very soon, in a day and a half's time. Either Iran reacts to this and reopens the Strait of Hormuz entirely, or we have two things. One, U.S. deterrence did not work. That has a huge impact worldwide, of course, when it comes to the United States' position in the world. But it also means if the U.S. president is willing to do what he said, then it leads to a huge escalation with attacks on power plants in Iran.
Ethan, I want to turn to you on the degree to which the U.S. and Israel are aligned here in their strategy going forward. So we had a couple of attacks over the course of the night, 100 people injured in Israel in these two attacks, one of which was on Dimona, which is a town very near to a nuclear research facility. That after we saw an attack on Iran's Natanz facility, Israel's military saying that they weren't responsible for that. Some ambiguity there, of course. But this all comes after the president encouraged Israel to sort of dial down, ratchet down its attacks, especially on infrastructure, a couple of days ago. How does this sort of affect the timeline and the trajectory of this conflict that we were just talking about?
David, it's very difficult to know. I mean, my instinct and my reporting tell me that there is quite close coordination at the level that matters, which is inside the closed rooms where they're deciding what to do, and that public statements are for a different purpose, which is their base at home, their upcoming elections, and so on. So, I mean, as we just noted a few days ago, the president said you mustn't do this, and today he's saying I'm going to do it. So, I don't think we should take too seriously the gap. Obviously, these are two countries with two sets of needs and two sets of histories in relation to this country. But fundamentally, this is a military operation. They're doing jointly, they're speaking constantly, and it will be, of course, up to the senior leader of the two, the president, to declare it over. But so far, he hasn't done that. So my sense is that, if I may say one more thing, which is that if, in fact, President Trump insists on securing wresting control of the Strait of Hormuz from Iran, he is asking for a much longer timeline than Israel would need for what it wants, which is to denature the nuclear and ballistic missile program. So suddenly, it's the United States which is stuck longer in this war, assuming he stands by what he said.
Ethan, you may always say one more thing. Skylar, I want to turn to you now because I know you also cover agriculture. We talk a lot about oil and energy not getting through the Gulf or LNG plants disrupting due to these strikes. But there's also a backlog of fertilizer not getting through. Talk to us about what that means for farmers in the U.S. and throughout the world.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, here in the U.S. right now, as we speak, it's the beginning of planting season for farmers, and they need fertilizer. And when you think about farmers, you could describe them as creatures of habit. And as they're entering planting season, if they can't get access to the fertilizer that they have orders from, that is going to create major disruptions for their planting season going forward. And this is already at a time where farmers in the U.S. have been hit by President Trump's tariff policies and are navigating everything from, China and soybeans and just getting their crops out with the tariffs being so up in the air. But no, this is a big deal. I mean, the administration has said that they are exploring, other avenues to try and get fertilizer through. They opened up some licensing with Venezuela. But for farmers who have, most likely never worked with Venezuela to then have to sort of pivot last minute to try and work with Venezuela because they can't get the fertilizer that they're used to having from the Middle East, that's raising a lot of questions. And farmers are very loyal supporters of President Trump. And farmers I've spoken to have said that it's sort of a double evil, that they agree that the president should be doing what he's doing, but also acknowledge that the war is not making life for them any easier.
And it's a hard gig.
Yes. Philip Crowther, let's widen our aperture a little bit here. Something we saw yesterday was Iran attacking Diego Garcia, or trying to get some intermediate range missiles to that island, which is a joint U.S.-UK base. And I wonder how that's reverberating across the region. This, I gather, is sort of making clear that Iran has missiles that are capable of going much farther than I think a lot of people thought. What are the implications of that going forward, even though this was a failed hit?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This essentially, more than anything, means that Iran might very well have the capacity to hit targets a lot closer, a lot further away, rather, from Tehran than might have been previously believed. Europe, in particular, probably looking at this very closely and thinking that this was a bit of a surprise. Now, together with apparently using missiles that one didn't know Iran has, Iran is also still using what we all knew it had in its arsenal. Iran still has ballistic missiles available to it. It is showing that on a daily basis here in the Gulf. It also has plenty of drones still available, it would appear, because just in the last hour or so, we got another alert here from the authorities in the UAE that there was a missile threat again. The same happened last night when people were told to go inside again. There have been, again, missiles heading toward Saudi Arabia, toward Bahrain as well, just in the last few hours. So Iran maintains quite a lot of firepower. Obviously, it is being degraded. There is no doubt about that by constant US and Israeli attacks. But it is still able to shoot missiles toward all of these Gulf countries. It must be said, of course, that a very high percentage of all of these missiles and drones that Iran uses in its counterattacks, in its retaliation, they are being shot down. But some do get through, as of course was the case with those attacks in southern Israel yesterday.
And Ethan, before we let you go, we've only got about a minute left, but I do want to ask you, of course, about Lebanon, which we're going to talk about more on the show. But Lebanon's foreign minister summoned Iran's charge d'affaires to basically tell them to stop interfering in Lebanese affairs. Can you explain the significance of that and if you think it'll make any difference to Israel?
Look, it's very significant because the power of Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, has been overwhelming in Lebanon for several decades. The desire of the Lebanese and the government of Lebanon is to reduce that power, and that, in theory, to disarm Hezbollah, to prevent it from taking the war into Israel as it has done repeatedly. The problem is it's just words at the moment, and the Israelis do not believe that the Lebanese government can get it done, and therefore it is doing it on its own. The Israeli army, a heavy engagement in southern Lebanon as we speak.
Okay.
We're going to talk more about that certainly in just a bit. We have Michael Leiter, the the Israel ambassador to the U.S. is going to be joining us in just a bit. But our thanks to all of you for joining us here this morning. Ethan Bronner in Israel, Philip Crowther joining us from Dubai, Skylar Woodhouse, our White House reporter, here with us on set in New York. And that interview with the Israeli ambassador coming up here in the next hour. In the meantime, continuing to look at President Trump's social media feed for inspiration here. Long lines at airports across the United States as TSA workers work without a paycheck. Hundreds even reportedly quitting their jobs. Now the president floating this plan to send ICE agents to airports to help with that work. We're going to get into that next, straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and at Bloomberg.com.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of our top stories. And Maui bracing for more storms. And this is as Oahu lifts its evacuation orders. Thousands of residents on Oahu, they were allowed to return home on Saturday afternoon after the island suffered its worst flooding in more than 20 years. Emergency crews, they've conducted at least 200 rescues on Hawaii's most populous island, which has been pounded by back-to-back storms for more than a week. Governor Josh Green said the damage could top $1 billion. United Airlines warning of surging fuel costs. In a memo to employees, CEO Scott Kirby said $175 oil prices, well, that would dramatically drive up jet fuel expenses. The airline already cutting capacity where routes are temporarily unprofitable due to the elevated price of jet fuel at the same time. He said the carrier is strong enough to weather a crisis and won't defer investments or furlough workers. And Bitcoin falling below 70,000. It's now down about 2.5% at just above 68,000. The digital currency 45% below the high of just over 126,000 that was reached on October 6th. It's weakened 20% so far this year. David, Christina, just part of the market volatility we've seen.
Even among that digital gold,
yes,
as it's called.
You were so excited to talk about gold yesterday.
So
yes, excited.
True.
All right, on a slightly less cheerful note, another effort to fund DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, failed in the Senate last night. That means TSA workers are going to go another day, possibly another week, without pay. and travelers should expect more of those increasingly long lines at airports.
Well, now President Trump is threatening to send ICE agents to the airports to help alleviate those lines. I'm going to bring in Bloomberg News senior reporter Miles Miller, who's here with us in New York, and Eric Bazail-Eimil, national security reporter for Politico. Miles, let me start with you and just ask you how this will work in practice. I struggle to imagine these ICE agents standing by these X-ray machines, asking me to take my shoes off or use separate bins for each of my pieces of luggage. Is that what the president envisions? What does this look like in actual practice?
Happen, but yeah.
Yeah, you know, a lot of this seems like posturing, right?
Yeah.
You know, you've got ICE agents who are not trained to do any of this TSA work. In fact, you know, the closest you'll get to ICE at an airport is probably Customs and Border Protection, which has been doing some of that work that ICE has been doing in the interior U.S. What it will look like is likely ICE agents, yes, helping to do the work of TSA and protecting and making sure that, you know, that folks are in their lines and everything. But the president has added an additional feature to this, which is that they could look for people in the country illegally and begin the process to remove them from the country. Now, you start to think, are people who would be in the country illegally be going to an airport, right? A lot of times, you know, you've got the visa issues that you don't know about. And so that is adding another layer to this. But we're talking about crazy lines at airports. Last check, 153 minutes, 153 minutes at ATL, 90 minutes at Houston. At one point yesterday, you were talking about 200 minutes at Houston.
Wow.
Right now in Philly, the line's backed up into the Marriott Hotel.
Crazy.
You just said you're heading to D.C. I recommend the train. Eric, I want to ask you kind of about the optics of this, because the administration has kind of been scaling back some of those more visual operations by ICE agents. That Tom Homan got put in charge. Kristi Noem is out at DHS. Maybe Mark-Wayne Mullins is coming in. Likely, we're going to talk about that in a second. But does this kind of go against the turn the administration was trying to make about ICE? And are they going to wear uniforms? Like, the visuals of this, is this going to help or hurt the Republicans' objectives going into the midterms?
You know, it's hard to say about the mechanics of it. The president's post was not particularly specific on whether they're going to be uniformed or not, whether, you know, we're going to see some of the other parts of it, you know, external removal operations as well as Homeland Security investigations doing this work. So we're going to have to see that roll out. We should view it through the prism of the funding fight as a tactic to try to escalate pressure on Democrats to cede and fund a bill at this point. How it'll, and you know, they can do this in part because ICE is already funded through these other measures. How that's going to play out in terms of the midterms, in terms of, you know, the president trying to shore up his footing on an issue that once was a surefire winning issue for him on the trail, that'll be, you know, that'll have to be seen. If we see altercations or we see incidences at airports, especially if they're caught on video, that can certainly raise additional new questions about ICE's tactics in the field and the broader tone and tenor of the administration's immigration crackdown.
The light has been on the Capitol Hill Dome these last couple of days. We have senators working through the weekend, and the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer addressed this yesterday. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
So today, Democrats offer to pay TSA without the anchor of demanding funding of ICE and CPB without any guardrails, which is what the Republicans are doing. We want to open TSA with no strings attached. Let me repeat, no strings attached. There's not one bill the Republicans have brought forward that doesn't have strings attached.
Miles, you heard him there say it and repeat it. No strings attached. It's kind of lays bare this standoff that we've seen between Republicans and Democrats now for more than a month. How do you see this resolving itself? This has been a kind of partial shutdown that, until recent days in these airports, as you've noted, has kind of gone unnoticed by a lot of people here. But it does seem like there's very little happening, very little ground being made up here on Capitol Hill.
I mean, can you imagine this happening right now during spring break for many across the country? The last time there was a shutdown like this, it was resolved because of these lines at the airport, but it seems Democrats are unwilling to change from their posture, right? What Democrats want are major policy changes when it comes to ICE. They want ICE agents to be able to have their name displayed, and they want judicial warrants when they're going into homes. Now, there did seem to be some sort of agreement or changes coming from the White House. Tom Homan spending a lot of time on Capitol Hill, but they want this to be they don't want it to be a clean bill just for TSA. They want this to be commingled. It remains to be seen if they'll ever come to an agreement, you know, anytime soon. Some were saying, you know, this could go on until the summer.
Eric, what about that? I mean, some even Republicans have suggested spinning out the ICE part of this and trying to get just the rest of DHS at least funded. Any likelihood of that, or do you think this is indeed stalled out for quite a bit?
It's really going to come down to whether Senate Republican leadership is going to allow it, because at this point, we have seen individual senators on the Republican side express their openness to it. But to do that would then fundamentally defang one of the main arguments that Republicans are making, that you can't just pick and choose different parts of the Department of Homeland Security to fund. You have to fund the whole thing. And it also would then contradict another argument they've been making, that, the argument about immigration enforcement is fundamentally moot because ICE and CBP are funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill. And as a result, when they're talking about FEMA or CISA or the TSA in this particular case, there's no need to do these hangups and continue this.
Miles, you'll excuse the glib question, but we were on air yesterday when Elon Musk, the world's richest man, put out this tweet indicating that he would be glad to pay the salaries of all of these TSA workers. Isn't that the path of least resistance here? Help us understand just sort of the budgetary pressures on this agency. This isn't the first time that TSA is going to bend in a vice like this.
Yeah, I think as Eric just laid out, the DHS was given a big pot of money, a significant pot of money during the last budget cycle with the big beautiful bill. Elon Musk's offer, while nice, I don't think is actually practical in the way that government financing and payrolls work. What this really needs to come down to is coming to some sort of agreement or agreeing on that TSA bill just for these workers. I was hearing reports from TSA workers who say that they are defaulting on their condos, that their cars are getting repossessed. They're not coming to work. And when you just have the shortage of people, it really is going to have to budge at some point. And it's unclear when that breaking point will happen. But I don't think that Elon Musk's money will be getting into any of those accounts. Perhaps, maybe they'll do those checks that Christina was doing in the past, where she was giving folks money for coming in, and they had some strings attached. You had to be like the best worker and all this kind of thing. So maybe that's what he can do, practically.
Speaking of Christina, Eric, we've got Markwayne Mullins made it out of committee by one vote. When do we think that it looks like he will get confirmed? I think at this point, when do you think he'll actually be invested, in his post? Because this is a time when it would be nice to have a head of an agency that's responsible for all of those things, given possible threats from abroad and everything else going on.
President Trump had said when he nominated Secretary Mullin that he was going to be in the post by March 31st. So we could certainly see this happen. If we're expecting at this point a cloture vote tonight in the Senate, which would be then the preliminary step for a Monday confirmation vote, even if it happens to be on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday, there's a real likelihood that we could see Markwayne Mullin join the administration by Friday or sooner. This could happen very, very quickly. I'll note that Christina has still been at DHS while this has been going on. The agency has not been without a cabinet secretary during this time period. But certainly having new energy through Markwayne Mullin, who is very respected on the Hill and is seen by many in the Republican Party as the kind of reset they need at DHS to face off these political headwinds, that'll certainly be a boon to the administration at this point.
Miles, on that point, what have we learned about what a Senator Markwayne Mullin would be like as Secretary Markwayne Mullin? I think about this in the context of the judicial warrants that you were just talking about a moment ago. We saw that New York Times reporting earlier this week indicating that maybe he's in favor of some of these changes to ICE. What have we learned? He was surprised by the president's pick. That was clear when he learned the news in real time.
That was a flashback to the first administration when people learned their job outcomes by Twitter. It was
hadn't been able to talk to Secretary
Noem.
Hadn't been able to talk to his family. But some weeks have passed since. What have we learned about how he'll approach this job if he's confirmed?
I think it'll be in some ways more of the same in terms of trying to be a hardliner on these immigration policies, and his response to some of these incidents that have led to this funding shutdown were much in line with the administration and much in line with Christina, right? That's not what got her out of her job. It was the issues with overspending, the issues with blaming President Trump for things and so on. Markwayne Mullin is in lockstep with the president, and so whatever the president says will go. And if there's been some reporting that the president is sort of backing away from the idea of these quotas when it comes to interior immigration enforcement, but I think he'll be a hard charger on all of the issues that are set forth by really Stephen Miller in consultation with Tom
Deputy
Homan.
Chief of Staff.
Right,
and Eric, quickly before we let you go, we've also got this possible $200 billion request from the Pentagon that they're trying to get tacked onto the reconciliation process. They need 60 votes. That seems unlikely. What's your take?
We've seen some Republican tepidness towards this. But and certainly the Republicans will want plenty of hearings to this. And I saw John Kennedy said, before the weekend that, he wasn't going to give the administration a blank check for military objectives in Iran. So if they try to get the reconciliation bill, through reconciliation, try to get more money in, like funding is going to get very, very, very sticky in the next couple months on Capitol Hill.
Miles, before I let you go, we've talked a lot about what this will look like in practice. How about, are there concerns about safety with TSA right now? I should have asked that earlier, so I'm not doing it.
I don't think so. The lines are long because they're going to make sure you take your 2 laptops out.
Yes.
That you take your shoes off if you don't have pre-check and all of that. So, they're still being as diligent as possible, but just with less people.
Miles Miller, thank you very much. Our senior reporter here at Bloomberg News, coming in to join us on set in New York. Eric Bazail-Eimil, who covers national security for Politico. Our thanks to you on this Sunday morning as well, as we get up to speed on, what's happening with the president's entreaty here, his indication he wants to send ICE agents to the airports to do some of the work of TSA agents. And as we continue to watch the goings-on Capitol Hill, Christina, involving Senator Mark Wayne Mullin, poised to become Secretary Mark Wayne Mullin, the first Secretary Mark Wayne, I think, in this nation's history.
I think that will be a first. And look, as you mentioned, he is striking a softer tone as he goes around and talks to lawmakers. He is open to things like judicial warrants. And that's what they needed. That's what the administration wanted at that agency, so they continue the work. And so that, as we were talking about, as Eric was mentioning, they can win voters back on their side with an issue that Trump really was ahead of before ICE agents and these videos and this controversy kind of turned some folks who were supporters of that. All right, coming up, as we've mentioned, Iran says it's only going to allow non-enemy tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, despite President Trump's demands to reopen that waterway by Monday. How is this crisis impacting American oil industries? That's up next on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on some of the top stories. And Elon Musk says his project to manufacture chips, it's going to be built in Austin and run by Tesla and SpaceX. It's called the Terafab Project, and it's his plan to eventually make his own chips for robotics, artificial intelligence, space data centers. Musk has said the semiconductor industry is moving too slow to keep up with the supply of chips he thinks he needs. To sports, we are through the first round of the NCAA tournament. 8 teams booked a spot in the Sweet 16 on Saturday, including 4 from the Big Ten. One of the upsets, Texas beat Gonzaga 74-68. 2 number 1 seeds move on to the next round, with Michigan beating St. Louis 95-72 and Duke topping TCU 81-58. And BTS's comeback concert, it drew a record-breaking audience to Seoul on Saturday. Over 250,000 fans attended the group's first concert in 4 years. It was streamed live on Netflix. Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw said after the concert, 14 songs of their new album were the 14 most popular songs on Spotify. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. We'll get into March Madness here a little bit later. I know there's a wide appetite for that. But in the meantime, David Gura here with Christina Ruffini. The war in Iran has sent oil prices to their highest level in years. Trump administration is lifting sanctions on some Iranian tankers to get more oil into the market. Some 45 million barrels set to start flowing soon from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Yeah, we spoke with Dustin Meyer. He's the SVP of Policy at API, that's the American Petroleum Institute, about the critical need to get oil moving again around the world. I want to start in Qatar because these attacks on the South Pars gas field have knocked out 17% of Qatar's LNG. And that's huge for Doha. It's going to be a loss of about $20 billion in revenue. And both folks I've spoken to on the ground and reporting says it's going to take years to repair. What does this mean long term for the viability of LNG from that country or even the region?
Yeah, Ras Laffan is the biggest LNG export project in the world, and Qatar is the second largest exporter in the world, and so this will have a major impact. It's a reminder how concerning the recent escalation in attacks on energy assets in the area are. That's one of the reasons why the industry was really welcoming the president's statement yesterday that going forward, these are not going to be the focus of attacks, and that both sides really need to de-escalate when it comes to the energy assets specifically, because they are so critical not just to the region but to the world.
I want to get a sense of what this disruption is like and how long it might take to repair that facility. And when you look at the whole natural gas apparatus here around the world and what's been hit, what's your sense of timing and timetable right now for getting things back up and running the way that they were?
Yeah, look, these disruptions are always a function of the scale and the duration. I think we have a sense of the scale. We know how much product, how much crude, how much LNG runs through the straits, but no one really knows the duration. It's clear that the market And the industry and the administration are focused on opening the straits as quickly as possible to really limit the damage that it does to markets. But one of the reasons why those attacks on the energy assets are so concerning, because when it does come to a resolution and the straits are reopened, that could add to the time that's required to bring those products back onto the market. And so that's why it's so important to dial down those attacks and make sure that those are avoided.
But I want to ask you, I mean, Iran has been threatening to do this for years, shut down the strait if action were taken against them. Why wasn't this something the industry as a whole was better prepared for, or is it just that there simply isn't another option?
Well, I mean, I do think that there's a lot that has been done to diversify supplies around the world, including from the United States. You know, I mentioned that Qatar is the world's second largest LNG exporter. Well, the world's largest LNG exporter is the United States. Yeah. We're the world's largest producer of natural gas, the largest producer of crude oil, and that does bring a lot more stability to markets than what otherwise would be the case. If you can imagine such a crisis breaking out generations ago when we were a major importer of both crude oil and natural gas, it would be a very different situation. And so that's been a big part of the strategy, is to diversify supplies. But there's no way getting around the fact that the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf continues to be a critical choke point.
API met with the White House in the last few days, talked about the situation, what could change. What are some of the actionable items that you're pushing for that you hope the administration does to make passage safer in this critical waterway?
Yeah, we welcome to have the conversation with the Vice President as well as Secretaries Burgum and Secretaries Wright. I think there's a lot of alignment in terms of understanding the importance of opening the Straits of Hormuz as quickly as possible. The administration does have a few levers that they can pull on, and they've wisely started to pull on those, drawing down the SPR, doing some Jones Act waivers, adding some liquidity in other ways to the marketplace. That adds more flexibility. Those are steps in the right direction, but I think everybody understands that for a disruption of this magnitude, there really is only one solution, which is reopening the straits. That was the message from the industry. That's exactly what the administration is focused on as well.
There's a couple U.S. naval ships that just left California about 2 days ago, and they're heading to the region, likely to help with potential escorts. I want to ask you first, are military escorts really a solution to this issue? And even if they are, those ships, it's going to take them quite a while to get there. What is the plan in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to those ships specifically, but I do know that the safety of the crews, of the workers in the region is the industry's #1 priority. And so, it is necessary to make sure that the shipping vessels have the insurance requirements, and the administration was smart to provide some insurance guarantees on that front. But it's clear that there is still a threat to the physical safety of the vessels and of the crews who operate them. And you're unlikely to see movement and additional transits until those security concerns can be alleviated. And so I think that inevitably is the next step, is finding a way to do that. How exactly that works, of course, we would be very deferential to the administration on, but that's what's needed clearly in order to open the straits.
Dustin, let's talk gas prices. I think a lot of people are worried about that, and the way that the president talks about it is it's very much a short-term escalation in price. Prices are up, they're going to come down. He says that's going to happen fairly quickly. What is your read on, A, how much higher they have to go here, and B, how much longer that's likely to last for consumers?
Well, I mean, you can already start to feel the impact, and that's not a surprise given what's happened, especially to crude oil prices. But as I said, it really is a function of the scale times the duration, and the duration is the big unanswered question right now. I will say that as we continue to navigate this, it is very important that we have so much U.S. supply out there. That meant that global markets were fairly well supplied going into this dynamic, and so that does provide a little bit of buffer and perhaps gives there a little bit more time, but the direction of travel here is very clear. We're going to have to open that strait, and markets are going to be volatile until there's a clear signal or a clear pathway for doing that.
What else would you like to see from the U.S. government?
They've been really responsive in terms of understanding the safety concerns of the industry. As I said, it makes a lot of sense what they're doing in terms of drawing down the SPR and coordinating that with our global partners. That really maximizes the impact, because these are global markets that are fully integrated. And so they've been smart to pull on those levers. And now they're altogether reasonable in keeping their main focus on reopening the straits as quickly as possible.
Dustin, is this crisis reframing at all the conversation about renewable energy? This is an administration that wasn't really prioritizing it, but at a moment where we see the difficulty of getting inexpensive oil and gas? Does it kind of elevate that conversation once again or change the way that we should be having it?
Well, I do think it's an important reminder of how necessary it is to control your own energy destiny. And the reality is that the United States has done a really nice job of that over the last 20 years as we've converted from being one of the world's largest importers to a net energy exporter, the world's largest producer of oil and gas. Not only does that provide more stability to global markets, but it does, to a degree, insulate the United States as well. And so making sure that we double down on energy production here in the United States of all forms, I think is absolutely a conclusion that a lot of folks are going to take coming out of this. The diversity of supply is always going to be important, both in terms of the types of supply and the location of the supply. The United States has done a nice job of that, but this is a reminder of how necessary that is.
Dustin Meyer from API, thank you so much for taking time. We really appreciate your insights this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And Christina, something I draw from that interview and a conversation we had yesterday is like what this moment means for American producers. So obviously the U.S. is in better shape when it comes to oil and natural gas because of its vantage on the world stage here. But certainly there's still this lag time to get a lot of these projects up online.
Well, and instinctively you think this is great for American producers, but both these guys told us not necessarily because they're losing a broader swath of customers as those prices go up and they can't afford it. They want to be able to produce and distribute to everyone and grow their facilities and grow their businesses, and that's harder to do when prices are so high.
Of course, prices set on the world stage as well. Coming up here, Lisa's going to be back. Some of the week's most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal.
And you can explore all our live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and much more. It's all in one place. Check out Bloomberg.com/videos. Stick with us. We will be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is time for BTW, or BT Dubs, as we call it around the office here.
Some of us do.
I like BT Dubs. Yeah. All right, so we're going to go to a bunch of the stories that you might have missed during the week that we want to focus on, and our own Lisa Mateo is going to kick it off.
All right, I want to start with one of the
Do you say BT Dubs, by the way?
I say BT Dubs, I do. I know you're outnumbered. Sorry.
I just wanted to get that.
But just people at home, BTW, Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you.
Also, there you go. All right, let's start with one of the most read on the terminal from this week. This one's from Bloomberg. So it says Oaktree's Howard Marks says investors are underestimating AI. So basically, he's the co-founder, right? Oaktree Capital Management. He sat down with Lisa Abramowitz at the Capital Markets Industry Conference. So a few things he said, that the power that gives AI its importance also gives us this unpredictability. So you don't know what it will or won't do. So he was kind of touching upon that. But I want to point out this thing that he also said is that at last month's announcement of Jack Dorsey's block about cutting 4,000 jobs, because
cut a lot of jobs.
Yeah,
right.
That kind of stood out to him too, because the power that gives AI importance also gives it that unpredictability. So that's what kind of he's talking about there. But something he also said that really stuck out from this article was that investors are probably better off buying shares of AI-focused company rather than lending it money.
Interesting.
So that was like an interesting twist to what he was saying.
And that's really been the story here. The concern has been rising about that lending mechanism.
Circular
financing. Kind of circular financing, everyone lending to one another. But I think obviously Howard Marks, eminent and wealthy investor, the latest in a line of folks who are kind of expressing concern about where all of this is headed and demanding at this point in time. They want to see something. They want to see some actual proof that this is leading to productivity gains.
There's also an argument that's gaining stock that a lot of these AI institutions or policies are coming from the top down, and they're not actually asking the people who do the work where AI could be helpful. So they're burning money, putting it in the wrong places where there are places it's really effective and places where it's cheaper and better to just keep your staff.
And worth paying attention to. We talk a lot about Iran. We have over the last few weeks, of course, and this widening war in the Middle East, but still this is very much front of mind for a lot of investors, the impact this is having and could have going forward.
Most definitely, definitely. I want to turn to our next one. Okay, so this is from the Wall Street Journal. So let's get to this headline. It's one of the hottest tables in America, and it's a college dining hall. Okay, we're talking about, I don't know how your dining halls were in college.
Not good.
Quite good. I got to say, mine was quite good.
That's it, really? Yeah. Okay. This is UMass Amherst. Okay, this is the one. Its dining halls have been ranked #1 for campus food in the country for 9 years, according to the Princeton Review. Serves about 30,000 students, but it's not just the students. The thing about this place that you're looking at is that it is open to the public, too. So adults go there on like date nights, and people go there on the normal. They pay about $12.50 for breakfast.
Come on, guys.
Come on. The next time you're in the Pioneer
Amherst is
Valley.
a nice place.
The food there, I mean, they have, so many different dining halls. They have different restaurants. You can get sushi. You can get any kind of bowl you want. You can get your pizza. You can get a Mediterranean station. And they change the menu all the time. And this is what people like about it. 30 cafes and markets, too, on top of it.
30 cafes.
I'm telling you, it is freshman 15. Can you not say? That's a lot of food.
All right, look, I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but maybe this is why college is getting incredibly expensive.
Maybe.
Well, their meal plan is about $3,600 for the semester.
All right,
to about $4,200.
I got nothing then. I got nothing.
So, just
your
goes
food
to show
wasn't
you.
good at college?
Well, now that we've said where I go to college,
Yeah,
I realize I need to dial that back.
you.
It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it, but it certainly wasn't date night draw. It was serviceable. is how I
You,
would
as an
say.
alumna, wouldn't go back.
No,
Or you're
I would
just
not.
visiting
It would not
town,
be a
you wouldn't go in.
destination trip to have the salad bar, which is pretty much where I lived.
Okay, have you guys taken a destination trip to the opera? Have you been to an opera?
Yes.
You have been to the opera?
Yes.
Wow.
Have you been to like a 5-hour opera? Close to?
No, I've done La Boheme at the Met here. I did go to a friend gave me tickets to a Wagner opera, and it was like 4 hours. And I did think I was going to scream inside my head in my very tight dress. Yes,
This is what it's about. Okay, so this is from the New York Times. Okay, the headline is Baby Carrots, Espresso Martinis, How New Yorkers Prepared for a 5-Hour Opera. Okay, so this is the Metropolitan Opera's new production. Excuse me if I pronounce this wrong. Tristan and und Isolde.
Molto bene, Lisa. That was very good.
I hope I pronounce it right. But it's getting rave reviews, but it's just too long. Like, it's nearly 4 hours, 5 if you count the intermissions with it. So what people are doing is they're pre-gaming with energy drinks, with espresso. At intermission, they're downing espresso martinis. I mean, I
think espresso is traditional, given, Italians and opera and...
True.
All right, you guys, why some of these operas are so long.
Why are they so long?
Okay, so back in Italy, when this is really popular, it costs more in Venice to heat one of those big palazzos for the night than it did to get box seats at the opera. So this is one of the things they did as aristocrats. They would just go to the opera every night, like we just go watch TV, because it was less expensive and less boring in the winter to go see an opera than to heat your entire giant leaky mansion.
Are you serious?
Yes. I'm not kidding. You can look this up. City of Falling Angels is a great book about Venice. It talks about this.
And people are doing this.
People are doing it. And you know what it is that they have a special under 40 night. So people under 40 get discounted
I'll gladly
tickets.
avail myself of that, everyone watching the show.
Me too. We can all do that.
We can all go. Sure.
I was eager to talk more about Timothy Chalamet in the context of this, as I'm sure you were as well.
Nailed it, Chalamet. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Given that I still can't say that name correctly, but I mean, are people going, Lisa? Like,
Yes,
is it getting
people
people in the
going,
door?
and that was packed. It was a Friday night, and there were a lot of younger people, and they're attracting this younger audience to the opera who are staying for 5 hours throughout the whole thing.
And evidently putting baby carrots in their pockets.
Yes, the baby carrots and
That's
veggies
what you
are
do.
key. Yes,
All right, well, crudité.
keep you through.
Crudité to go. Lisa,
Listen, I think that's great.
thank you, as always.
Thank you,
Lisa
Lisa.
Mateo with BT Dubs. BT Dubs.
BT
On
Dubs.
Bloomberg this weekend. Much more to come here. We're going to have the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Leiter, is going to join us here. So we have all of this news on a more serious note, of course, swirling in the Middle East. We just heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this morning. He's encouraging more allies to support the U.S. and Israel in this campaign that continues here in its third week. He's going to join us live here in just a few minutes.
All right, the next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. here in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, here alongside Lisa Mateo, bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, analysis this morning and every Saturday and Sunday morning starting at 7 o'clock Wall Street time. And our focus once again is on the Middle East, Israel and Iran trading missile attacks over the course of the evening, and some very delicate targets, Christina, in the sights of both of those countries, one near a nuclear research facility in Israel, another, the Natanz nuclear site in Iran.
That's right, and there's still some debate as to who exactly was responsible for that strike near Natanz, Israel, or the U.S., but Iran has reciprocated and taken a strike near a nuclear facility in Israel, and there are reports of about 100 injuries so far, and the Prime Minister visited there this morning. We'll have more on that shortly, but first we want to get to Lisa Mateo and the headlines.
You got it. And President Donald Trump giving Iran a 2-day deadline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or risk getting its power plants bombed. This was a post on social media yesterday around 7:44 p.m. Eastern time. The president said Iran has 48 hours to fully open that waterway without threat. If not, he said the U.S. would, quote, hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Iranian media is reporting that Tehran will strike U.S. infrastructure in the region if its plants are hit. Now, the conflict has resulted in over 4,000 deaths, a surge in oil and natural gas prices. More than 150 people were injured in Israel on Saturday. Multiple Iranian strikes in the country's south as Tehran retaliated for an attack on its own nuclear facility. Now, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said the joint campaign would intensify significantly a day after Tehran launched ballistic missiles at U.S.-UK military base in Diego Garcia. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, he is slamming GOP lawmakers for not coming to an agreement to fund the DHS in order to get the TSA workers back to work and paid.
Republicans, in essence, say they want to reopen all of DHS, but only if there are no changes to ICE and Border Patrol when they vote. That's not acceptable, not just to us, not just to Democrats, but to the American people.
Majority Leader John Thune, he responded about negotiations at a press conference yesterday.
The offer was made and legislative language was submitted by the administration to open up the Department of Homeland Security with a lot of reforms that have been requested and asked for by Democrats. And at some point, the Democrats are going to have to take yes for an answer.
TSA workers have been without pay for 5 weeks. That's pushing a lot of them to call out sick. And that's led to long lines, long delays at major airports during the busy spring break season. President Trump now threatening to send in ICE agents to U.S. airports as soon as Monday if Democrats don't agree to a funding plan. And former FBI Director and Special Counsel Robert Mueller has died at the age of 81. Mueller oversaw the landmark investigation into alleged ties between the Russian government and President Trump's 2016 campaign. The president posted on social media minutes after the passing was announced, saying, quote, Robert Mueller just died. Good. I'm glad he's dead. He can no longer hurt innocent people. But David and Christina, he's been known to kind of sound off on people he doesn't quite agree with. Remember that with Rob Reiner, Director Rob Reiner.
Yes, that's true
after
as well.
He passed, he did that as well.
Not one to shy away from an opinion. Lisa, thank you so much. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke out on the recent attacks in southern Israel, writing, quote, Israel is determined to continue to strike our enemies on all fronts. Now, this comes just 24 hours after President Trump said this outside the White House.
Do you think Israel will be ready to end the war when you're ready?
I think so. Mr. President, the relationship's a very good one. I think so. Mr. President, we want more or less similar things. You know what we want? We want victory, both of us, and that's what we've got.
Joining us now is Wendy Benjaminson. She's Bloomberg News senior DC editor. Wendy, the U.S. has given Iran a 48-hour deadline to open the strait, but there's also reporting this morning that the White House is planning for peace talks. How do those two things work with each other? Because it doesn't seem like Iran, optically, politically, could give the U.S. anything at this point to stop that strike, and that the U.S. is not going to be able to pursue peace talks after hitting these targets that it says it's going to in about 30 some odd hours now.
Right. And Christina, that's the pattern we've seen for the last 3 weeks through the extent of this war, is Trump says, I'm going to protect the Strait of Hormuz. Then he asks for the allies to protect the Strait of Hormuz. And when they say no, he calls them cowards and then says it's up to them to police it. We're going to back off. And now he's essentially saying he's going to police it. And within 48 hours, if the Strait of Hormuz is not free and flowing as it normally is, then he will bomb their power plants, which just a few days ago he told Israel to stop doing. So now he's saying he will join in. So, and in terms of his comments that he wanted to wind down the war, this would be an escalation. And I believe Netanyahu said today that they were only halfway through the wars and wanted other countries to join. So you have even the two antagonists in this war, not agreeing with each other. So it's very unsettling, not only to Americans, but I'm sure to everyone involved.
Do you think the U.S. do you think Israel can sustain this war if President Trump and the U.S. decides to pull out?
Well, it depends if they're getting, if the U.S. continues to supply them with weapons, then yes, it can be a sustained war. And it will essentially be is a war of weapons attrition. It will be who runs out of missiles first, Israel or Iran. Now, Iran is getting some help from Russia and maybe China, and Israel would be getting help probably from the United States. So, this could go on for a while.
All right, Wendy
And
Benjaminson.
Iran has no interest in coming to the peace talks while these threats are in the air.
Of course. I'm sorry for getting you off there. Wendy, thank you
No.
so much for joining us. We appreciate you.
As what he said just a moment ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed those strikes that took place, some of which targeted holy sites. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
If you want proof that Iran endangers the entire world, the last 48 hours have given it. In the last 48 hours, Iran targeted a civilian area. They're doing that as a mass murder weapon. Luckily, no one was killed, but that's due to luck, not their intention. Their intention is to murder civilians. Second, they fired on Jerusalem right next to the holy sites of the three monotheistic faiths, the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And by dint of a miracle again, none of them were hurt, but they were targeting the holy sites of the three major monotheistic religions.
Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Dr. Michael Leiter, joins us now. And I want to start there, if I could, Mr. Ambassador. The Prime Minister mentioning attacks on civilian areas, on holy sites. We also saw attacks seemingly very close to a nuclear research facility in Israel as well. And I wonder if you could kind of get us up to speed on where things stand with that. The strikes were on Dimona. I gather that's close to this nuclear research facility. How close exactly? Did it sustain any damage? And how does this kind of change the trajectory of this conflict?
Well, the strike in, first of all, good morning, David, Christina. The strike in Dimona resulted in fatality and a number of people injured. Not too far from Dimona, a missile hit Arad, where we had close to 100 people injured, 10 of them seriously. So it did result in some mass casualties. Did not strike our research center, but that's certainly where it appears they were aiming. Although they do aim to maim and kill as many innocent people as possible, they target residential areas and, as the Prime Minister said, religious sites, tourist sites, wherever they can create the most damage. But we're proceeding according to plan. This is not instant soup. This is a war against a regime that's been in power for 5 decades and has brutally suppressed its people, and of course continues to be a threat to the entire region.
Ambassador, who carried out the strike next to the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran? Was that Israel or the U.S.?
To the best of my knowledge, Israel did not strike at Natanz. But again, this is a coordinated effort, and I don't believe that we discussed particular operational issues online. But I do not believe that Israel struck at Natanz.
I also want to ask you, the messaging from the American president has been saying that the U.S. has been very successful. Iran's military capability has been completely degraded. But we see the strike this morning, and we see the strike against Diego Garcia. What is your assessment of Iran's current strike capability? Because it seems like they still are able to cause damage.
Well, again, this is something that doesn't transpire overnight. This is a large, malign regime that has to be dealt with. Look, just imagine that they would have a nuclear-tipped weapon. The ballistic missiles that they're firing right now would have a nuclear tip. The way that the world is being held hostage right now at the Strait of Hormuz would be that much more difficult, that much more threatening. A barrel of oil would reach $250 if they wanted it to. So this at some point has to be stopped. This is a malign regime that's holding the world hostage. And it's going to take some time, hopefully not too long. But we see dramatic cracks in the system. The edifice of this tyrannical regime is cracking. It has not opened up to wide chasms yet, but that's the direction it's going. We're seeing a degradation not only in their ability to fire these ballistic missiles, to get their drones off, but also in the morale. We have small units within the system of the IRGC and the Basij, which are not turning their weapons yet on their superiors, but they're not showing up for work. And that's a first. It's developing, and it's a process. We never knew exactly when the Soviet Union would fall or exactly when the Romanians would turn their guns against Ceausescu. But this is a people, 92 million, who want freedom, who want something else, who don't want the boot of the repressive regime on their necks anymore. So it's quite possible that we're going to see these cracks develop more, and refusal on the part of these brutal people to turn their guns against their own citizens.
Let me ask you about that. You mentioned those 92 million people. You see that the devastation and destruction that Israel and the U.S. have rendered on Iran's military sites and other places. If we do not see Iranians rise up, if we don't see regime change in any sort of traditional sense, are we at a moment or near it when Israel and the U.S. might say, look, both of those countries have devastated this country sufficiently. There won't be regime change. It's worth packing up and going home. Or is that really the end goal here? And what's your assessment of the level of patience and timeline for that to happen?
David, the end goal here is that there is not a power, an entity in Tehran which is capable of firing massive numbers of ballistic missiles, achieving a nuclear weapon, and supporting proxies around the region. If that can be achieved through the collapse of this regime, so be it. If not, that's the minimum we have to achieve. Remember, everybody's kind of surprised when negotiations stop. But, look, these people are murderers. They're mass killers. And murderers do not tell the truth. So to go into a negotiation with people who lie as a matter of fact. I mean, look at the ICBM that was fired yesterday. I mean, they claimed for years and years we don't have an ICBM. Well, they did, and the ICBM that can be fired at 4,000 kilometers, give them a little bit more time, and they're going to have an ICBM that's going to hit Chicago. So these people, they come in with their Cheshire cat grin, their smugness, and lie. So what is a negotiation worth with people who murder and lie? We have to achieve a situation where they simply are not capable of wreaking havoc on their neighbors and on the entire world.
To that end, I wonder if there are any concerns that it might have been a miscalculation to go after some of Iran's historic sites, to go after some of the energy infrastructure, because does that make it harder to accomplish that goal, to either get a regime that doesn't threaten Israel or its allies, or if the regime does fall, to then install a functioning government if the country and the infrastructure isn't there?
It's a great question, Christina. Look, there's a dilemma here, okay? I mean, and it's a fair dilemma when we're talking about strategy. If the regime is going to stay, or some form of this regime is going to stay in power, then it's absolutely necessary to devastate their national infrastructure, so they're incapable of malign actions in the future. If they're not going to stay in power, then you don't want to destroy the national infrastructure because you want them to be able to resuscitate themselves. So we're moving, I think, in a parallel fashion, and that's going to depend. You have to make an assessment from day to day, from week to week. That's very much an operational assessment on the part of our militaries. So I think it's going to become clear over the next week or so, but we're marching in that direction to completely eliminate the possibility where there's going to be an entity in Tehran which is going to be able to fire these ballistic missiles, support the Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. I mean, just think about it. If tomorrow, the Houthis take over the Bab el-Mandeb passageway, the Straits of Aden, so we're going to have a situation where the entire world market is going to be shut down because of the whim of an Ayatollah sitting in Tehran. I mean, this is just simply unacceptable. It can't continue. And they've been calling our bluff now for 5 decades, and this has to stop. For us in Israel, it's an absolutely existential issue, immediate existential issue, because we see what these ballistic missiles can do. And if they have hundreds that they can fire in every round, which was their plan after the June war, to build thousands of these medium-range ballistic missiles and fire them all at once in order to overwhelm our multi-layered missile defense system. If they're able to do that, that Israel's a tiny country. It's the size of New Jersey. We simply can't allow that to happen. But it's not just Israel. I mean, look at their firing into all their neighbors, to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to the Emirates, to Bahrain. They're particularly focused on the Emirates because the Emirates, is a projection of a very moderate Islam that accommodates the West, that accommodates Judeo-Christian civilization. They hate the Emirates more than anybody else. And that's why they fired so many of these drones into the Emirates. And we're delighted to be able to assist them as much as we can.
Mr. Ambassador, let me interrupt if I could, just because
this malign regime has to be brought down.
Last question here is just about Lebanon. You'll forgive a basic question here, but what are Israel's goals there? We see 800,000 people displaced there, torrential rains affecting many of those people who have been displaced. As we look at where there might be daylight between Israel and the U.S., do you feel like the U.S. supports Israel's attacks on Lebanon, and where do you see them leading to?
Well, let me push back on that question, David. Israel's attacks on Lebanon are a reaction to Hezbollah's missiles being fired into our cities. We are not going to allow a terrorist entity that has taken over our northern border, has sapped it of its strength to fire missiles into our communities. It's just that simple. I mean, just imagine that, you had missiles coming over from Canada into Montana. I mean, you'd erase the other side of the border. So we want peace with Lebanon. There's no reason in the world we can't live in a harmonious peace with our northern neighbor. Most of the Lebanese want it as well, but their country has been occupied by this terrorist entity. So we have to protect our northern border, and ultimately, the Lebanese themselves have to rid their country of this malign influence coming out of Tehran.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for the time. That's Ambassador Michael Leiter, who joined us from Washington, D.C. He's the Israel's ambassador to the United States. And Christina, this is something I know a lot of attention is now being drawn to, sort of what's been happening in Lebanon. And the UN Secretary General there recently as well, pointing out that size of that humanitarian
Of course. And the issue is that's already a country that's on the ropes, both economically and politically. And is it better for the region or not if that country implodes? We're
going to dig into some more of these issues with Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group in just a moment here. Look at how this wide war is spreading, continuing, and kind of parse some of what the president said to reporters and on social media overnight. Coming up here on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this news just coming in. President Donald Trump says ICE agents will be going to U.S. airports starting tomorrow. In a post on social media this morning, the president said it's to help TSA workers who have, quote, stayed on the job despite the fact that the radical left Democrats who are only focused on protecting hardline criminals who have entered our country illegally are endangering the USA by holding back the money that was long ago agreed to with signed and sealed contracts and all. TSA workers, they have been without pay for 5 weeks. Now, in other news, Maui bracing for more storms as Oahu lifts its evacuation orders. Thousands of residents on Oahu, they were allowed to return home on Saturday afternoon. That's after the island suffered its worst flooding in more than 20 years. Emergency crews, they've conducted at least 200 rescues on Hawaii's most populous island, which has been pounded by back-to-back storms for more than a week. Governor Josh Green said the damage could top $1 billion. An Apple CEO, he is praising the innovations of Chinese developers.
China's excellently talented developer community is pushing the limits of innovation every day. And we're inspired by the many ways Chinese developers are using technology to build tools that help people learn valuable skills, manage their health, and bring new ideas to life.
That was Cook. He was speaking at the China Development Forum in Beijing today. His comments come days after the ruling party's flagship newspaper criticized Apple for monopolistic policies. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. Thanks for that update.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, G7 foreign ministers say they are ready to take, quote, necessary measures to support global energy supplies and safeguard maritime routes, including through the Strait of Hormuz.
All this just days before the allied countries meet in Paris later this week, but after, I should note, President Trump's 48-hour deadline for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz or face what he calls the obliteration of that country's energy infrastructure. Joining us now is Ian Bremmer. He's the president and founder of Eurasia Group. Ian, great to have you with us. And earlier this week, you were writing about the prospects of of there being an off-ramp for President Trump. We've seen a lot of vacillation over the last, say, 72 hours from the White House when it comes to the tack that the administration is taking vis-a-vis this war. Your sense of where that off-ramp is and what access the U.S. has to it right now?
Well, it's hard to have an off-ramp when the people you were talking to are dead. We saw that at the beginning of the war, and we saw that with Larijani as well. There had been some back-channel conversations with him, and then he's gone. So that is challenging. Also, the level of incoherence that has come from the American president. If you're an Iranian leader watching, you've got to be thinking this feels like panic. It feels like urgency. And that the only lever that the Iranians have, which is the economic pain that is coming from keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed, is actually working. So, I mean, on the one hand, I see continued escalation from the United States and Israel. And on the other hand, I see the Iranians with little capacity to negotiate, a little faith in negotiations, and also at least some semblance of a belief that their own deterrence is starting to bear fruit.
And I want to ask you, I asked many people this question yesterday, and I'm not sure we ever really got the answer. Can you explain, giving the administration the benefit of the doubt possibly, can you explain the policy behind this OFAC waiver for Iranian oil, most of which is likely going to be purchased or already purchased by China? On its face, it seems like the U.S. has just put money in Iran's pocket and given a strategic competitor a discount on energy. But there has to be another thing that I'm not thinking of.
I think that the United States is hitting Iran incredibly hard with its military capabilities. But the vulnerability is on the economic side. And on that side, the absolute short-term priority for Trump is get the price down, get more oil out under any circumstances possible. And clearly he believes that there is some marginal benefit to price that comes from getting more of that oil out, and not necessarily in the hands of the Chinese, but instead to countries that the Americans are more nominally aligned with. Now, keep in mind that Trump's long-term plan remains take the oil. It's Venezuela redux. So I guess what the Trump administration would say in response to your question is, yeah, in the near term, this in principle goes to the regime, but the regime is not going to be able to use that for very long. We're going to take Karg Island. We're going to have the oil. That's why you've got thousands of American troops that are heading their way to the region. I do understand that it is incoherent in the short term, and Secretary of Treasury Bessent was doing his damnedest to try to frame it in that several hundred-word tweet that he put out, and he wasn't really convincing anyone with market experience.
There's some analysis out this morning from Regional Energy Group that says that Gulf capitals are increasingly concerned that Washington could move to wind down the conflict before securing a durable resolution on maritime access, leaving Iran with de facto control over traffic through the strait. Do you think that's a legitimate concern and something that people need to start looking at?
Well, it's a legitimate concern, not just for the Gulf states. I mean, at this point, the Americans do believe that you're going to see fewer ballistic missile strikes from Iran over the coming weeks. Now, they've said that before, and they've been overconfident, but there's been a lot of damage done. It's hard for them. They can't build more ballistic missiles in this wartime environment, given the damage to their military infrastructure that primarily the Israelis have done. But drones are a different story. And that means that for the foreseeable future, and here we're talking months and months at a minimum, this Iranian regime, if they wish, are going to be capable of continuing to pose threats to anything that goes through the strait, and to ongoing production and capability of Gulf energy infrastructure. Yeah. So, yeah, the Gulf is concerned about that, and they don't want the United States to stop now having started the war until that is resolved in some way. And we're hearing that from the Saudis, hearing that from the Emiratis, hearing that from the Qataris, the Kuwaitis. I mean, all of these countries have economic models that don't function with this level of violence and threat in their backyard.
Ian, something I've valued about your writing for so many years is how you look at the shifts in multilateral alliances. And I'd love to kind of bring that experience to bear in the context of this conflict. You had the U.S. and Israel going this alone from the get-go, but now we've heard entreaties from both the President of the United States to other countries to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Now we hear it from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this morning. There has been assembled, I guess, this coalition of a willing of sorts, 22 countries who are going to help the U.S. in its efforts to keep that strait clear and open, or clear that strait and make it open. What is your sense of the state of these fragile alliances? Of course, we've heard the rhetoric from the Trump administration here over the last year plus toward its longstanding U.S. allies. How fractured are they, and sort of how more fractured are they as a result of this conflict?
They're very fractured. In fact, I mean, this idea of a rupture that my friend Mark Carney put out there during Davos is clearly the way that the Europeans feel as well, that there is no level of trust of the United States president and of what the Americans think of their allies and how they treat their allies going forward. But the Europeans desperately need the strait open. Trump is certainly right about that. And also the Americans are the dominant military force, not just for the Europeans, but in the world. So as much as they may mistrust the United States, they recognize that the U.S. remains very important for them. And I have seen a change in the diplomatic posture towards the United States from Europeans, from this not our war, we want no part of it, to we're not going to engage in the fighting, but we understand that we collectively have a problem now, irrespective of who started it, and we need to try to engage with you. We hear you, find a way to work together to eventually have the straits safe and passable. But I do not see Europeans, as of today, I don't see Europeans that would be willing to send forces to bring the strait open during this level of fighting. And I think, by the way, the United States is a minimum of 4 weeks, a minimum, best possible scenario where they would be able to actually bring escorts to start moving ships peacefully through the strait. So I don't think that's yet priced in to the markets, and it's certainly an ongoing problem where the Americans and the Israelis are going it alone.
And on that note, escorting ships through the strait is not the same thing as securing the strait and having it open to its normal capacity. It seems like this is something the U.S. cannot do alone. Trump has seemed to need to call in these allies. I was reading this morning, part of that is after the Cold War, the U.S. actually got rid of some of its minesweeping capabilities in the theory that if it were to need something like this, it would be part of a NATO operation. Can you talk to us just about the capability? Is this something the U.S. can do alone if it so chooses, or does it need those allies, which sometimes the president doesn't like to rely on?
I'm a political science expert, not a military analyst. So I'm not speaking in school if I answer that question directly.
Fair enough.
But what I can say is that in the White House and in CENTCOM, they are a lot less concerned about dealing with mines than they are dealing with drone strikes going forward. That has been the principal thing that has addled them, as well as the concern that what do you do if the Houthis suddenly get fully involved in this conflict? There is some evidence that the Houthis are already involved, that some of the drone strikes through the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia came from the Houthis in Yemen. It's hard to imagine any other geography that would have brought those strikes in that area. But that's muscle flexing. That's very different from hitting the pipeline, bringing 7 million barrels of Saudi crude to market, shutting down the Red Sea, that kind of thing. Also, the White House very concerned about that.
Ian, very quickly here, we've got about a minute left. You raise an interesting point in your most recent note. You say the Iran war now feels a bit like the early days of the pandemic to you. I thought that was such a fascinating line. Explain that, if you would, what that indicates about sort of where this might be progressing going forward beyond 4 weeks' time.
It means that we all see that there's a problem and we're worried about it and it's dominating headlines, but we're not thinking about the second and third order implications that are going to affect all of us in the global economy for a much longer period of time, say for a year or more. and how this is going to rupture America's relations in the Gulf, about the future of Israel in the world as a consequence, about the future of asymmetric warfare and drones as a consequence. We're certainly not thinking enough about the longer term implications of this suspension of global supply chains in so much of the economy beyond oil, for example, fertilizer, the planting season, food as a consequence. Plastics that come from hydrocarbons. I mean, every auto part imaginable. Sort of packaging for consumer durables. Yeah. I mean, this is going to take months before it really hits prices in the market. But when it hits, it's going to be with us for a long time. And every day that we aren't addressing the Strait is going to be a much longer period of time on the back end that we're all feeling that as consumers.
Ian, thank you very much. That's Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of Eurasia Group. Appreciate your insights and time
nice to see
on
you.
this Sunday morning. Later this hour, the Canadian Conservative leader, Pierre, is going to make his case that dropping tariffs would help American workers.
And up next, Alex Rodriguez ahead of baseball's opening day. It's Bloomberg This Weekend.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura alongside Christina Ruffini and Lisa Mateo.
All right, so Major League Baseball's opening day.
You've been waiting for this.
Listen, we talked about this in the break. I'm not a sports girly, but I do love going to a baseball game. Right. And Lisa, you sat down with A-Rod to talk baseball and business.
Yeah, Alex Rodriguez. So he's going beyond sports. He's also a businessman. So I got the honor. I got to sit down with him over at Bloomberg Invest, talk to him a little bit of a few things about what he looks for an opportunity. Also, when are the Yankees going to win another World Series?
Question.
And finally, of course, how he got to start in real estate.
Look, I was born right here in New York City, 1975, in the shadows of old Yankee Stadium, the house that Babe Ruth built. And I come from humble beginnings. And, we were lifelong renters. And as a young man, I said, boy, if I can ever trade places with a landlord, I will. Because we had to move every 18 months. And that kind of inspired me to one day be on the other side of that trade. And I had an opportunity about 10 years later, in my early 20s, and is when I made my first real estate investment. And it was just a small duplex, and then we sold that for double, and we did it again and again. And now over the last 25 years, we've acquired more than 20,000 keys, multifamily, and it's been a good business.
It definitely has. You've looked up to people like Warren Buffett, to Magic Johnson. What's some of the best advice they've given you, or something that sticks out in your head?
I think what Warren Buffett has taught me is, stay in your circle of competence, right? Don't be wide and shallow, go narrow and deep. And what are the 2 or 3 things you do really good that you have a competitive advantage? And then when I was playing, he would say 2 things. Be the best baseball player you can be, and be a gentleman, because reputation is everything.
There you go.
Yeah.
Words to remember. So you expanded beyond real estate. Your portfolio has grown so much. What do you look for in an opportunity?
Well, I mean, the one constant today is change, and things are changing faster than ever. When you look at AI and how it's transforming business, some for the good, some for the bad. But we do 3 things at A-Rod Corp. We do real estate, which is our legacy business. We do sports. We own our 2 franchises in Minnesota, the Timberwolves and the Minnesota Lynx. And then we own part of about 30, 35 companies in which we made investments, most of them minority, some majority. But we look at companies that we have an opportunity to help more than just our capital. Do we have a great passion for it? Do we understand it? And can we actually bring value to the founders? And that's really what we think about it. And obviously we want to buy at the right price and buy really good businesses.
Now, you've had so much success, but you've also had some setbacks, and you've been very open about it. Your docuseries, Alex versus A-Rod, incredible series. You really opened up in there. Even maybe there were some business transactions that didn't go quite the way you wanted. How do you handle those setbacks, or what lessons have you learned from them?
Well, I think, look, when I just turned 50, right? And when you've been around a while, you hindsight's always easier to go back and go, oh, I wish I didn't make that decision or that decision. But I think you have to lead with it. And my mistakes, whether it's been in baseball or anything else, where I used to be ashamed of it, now I've had a great opportunity to turn the lens inward, do a tremendous amount of work over the last 10 or 15 years, and I lead with it now. And I just lay all the cards on the table. But learning from your mistakes and then being able to play offense in the future, it's worked well for me.
Excellent. Yankees opening day around the corner. What does this current team have? Does it have the DNA to be a championship team, or maybe what are they missing?
Well, I think they're going to get some health back. Garrett Cole coming back is huge. It comes down to a few things. It comes down to great pitching, good defense, situational hitting. Obviously, the Aaron Judge elephant in the room is he's 34, so that window starts closing at some point. So if you're the Yankees and you're the fan base, you want to capitalize on one of the greatest players of our generation to be able to collect a world title. And the key is, as you get to October and right before the playoffs, is I call it the 2 H's. You want to be healthy and you want to be hot. And hopefully they can do that this year.
What do you think about robot umpires entering the season this year? What's your take on it? How is it going to change the game?
You can make an argument that it can make it better, right? But I'm a big proponent for umpires. I think umpires are, in many ways, they're underpaid, they're underutilized, and underappreciated. I mean, if you think about an umpire or referee in sports, you have 9 players from each team screaming at you. You have both managers. You have 2 catchers that are not happy. You have hitters that are not happy. But at the end of the day, when you have some of the great umpires that I've been around and I've been fortunate to work with, and I can think of over a dozen of them, they make the game better. They control the pace of the game. They're a big part of the game, and I just think we can't really forget how important they are, because it's still a human game played by humans.
Yeah, they get a bad rap.
I think so, and they're very, very good. I mean, if you think about an umpire who may have to call 300 balls and strikes, and you miss 5, they're going to scream at you for 50, right? So I'm a big believer in umpires. I'm a little bit old school there.
Okay, let's take you from baseball to basketball. You joined the ownership team behind Minnesota Timberwolves, the Minnesota Lynx. The landscape is changing for sports management, ownership, kind of going away from the family-owned business. How do you think, I mean, big money involved as well. How do you think it's going to impact sports, or particularly the sports fans?
Which part? The fact that you have institutional capital coming in?
Correct.
Well, it's interesting because, this happened a little bit after COVID. And I remember 6th Street made a big investment into the San Antonio Spurs, and that was like a big wow moment. I think it's a great tool. I think you still have to have guardrails, but I think so far for the NBA it's worked really well. NFL's now dipping their toe in where you can buy 10% from institutional capital. That's also going to be very interesting to watch. And I think for baseball, where it is right before a big collective bargaining agreement negotiation, it'll be interesting because I do think that right now, I'm a contrarian by nature, is the best time to invest into a baseball team because of all the unanswered questions. And it's very fluid right now. People don't know what's going to happen with the CBA. Are you going to strike? Are you not going to strike? There's a lot of moving parts. What happens with regional sports networks? Is Rob Manfred going to try to bundle them, all of them, just like Roger Goodell has in the NFL? And it's worked out beautifully for them. So because there's so many questions, it's a good time to buy at a pretty decent multiple.
And there's been a lot going on in Minnesota itself. I mean, you've had the ICE agents on the streets. How do you talk to the team about this? Because obviously they're going through a lot mentally as well through all this.
Yeah, it's a very, very sad time in Minnesota for the people there that have to endure so much. The one great thing about sports, it's the time that we can all agree that we can all wear the color blue for the Timberwolves, or purple, or whatever color we're wearing that night. And it unifies people. We have 20,000 people every night at our game. We have a game tonight. And it's just great when you have 20,000 people cheering for one team, smiling, hugging, not asking political questions, not caring about political issues, but really caring about, can the Timberwolves win tonight? Can Anthony Edwards score 35 points? And I think the Timberwolves and the Lynx have been a uniter and really a great medicine for the people of Minneapolis.
And I have to talk about the deal. Jason Kelly, your partner in this. Yeah. What can we expect for the next season?
Well, we have some incredible guests, which we're not ready to announce yet. But the first 3 seasons have been really great. Jason Kelly has been a dream partner. He's a great quarterback. I call him Tom Brady.
Nice.
And we have a lot of fun. We have some incredible guests. And now we're having really, really prominent people calling us to say, hey, can we go get on the deal? Which is really exciting for us.
Have you learned anything from this show, business-wise?
Oh, I've learned so much. I mean, really it's a masterclass. When you see the type of people, both men and women, from all walks of life, from all walks of fields of business and sports. They just give you some incredible gems, some great nuggets. And if you're young entrepreneurs, must watch TV because you can learn so much in a matter of 30 or 45 minutes.
All right, you can listen to The Deal. That's with Alex Rodriguez, Jason Kelly, anywhere you get your podcast. You can also watch it, too. It's on Bloomberg Originals and also on Bloomberg TV.
How excited were you to have this convo? You're a Yankees fan. I mean, that must have been like...
There was a moment where we weren't sure the scheduling was going to work out, and I was going to have to do this interview instead of Lisa, and I was really excited to meet Aaron, but like the worst person in the world to do that interview. You did such a great job. I'm so glad you did it.
What are your thoughts on Aaron Judge? He says he's being healthy and hot going in October.
That's the thing, because he kept saying he's 34. He's getting up there. I'm like, it's so sad that's
an old man
baseball.
by
Yes,
MLB
I know.
standards.
But you have to take advantage of him now. You know, he's the leader of this team, and you have to make sure he stays healthy, make sure he gets through the regular season, because during playoffs, that's kind of when he starts to fall back a little bit. He's had that history, but he's hoping. He's crossing his fingers.
My son is as well.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Mr. Judge.
All right, stick with us. We've got a lot more news ahead. Some baseball, some not, mostly not. This is Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura.
We're here with Lisa Mateo. We'll be right back.
I want to bring you now my conversation with Pierre, Canada's Conservative Party leader.
Who's the audience for the speeches that you've been giving on this trip? Is it members of the administration, Americans broadly? Who are you hoping to convey that message to?
The latter. I think first of all, I believe in leverage. We're, as a country, going into renewal of the USMCA, as you call it, CUSMA, as we call it. And one of the greatest leverage points we have as Canadians is the goodwill of Americans. Poll after poll shows Americans like Canadians. They also understand that doing business with us is good for them. So I wanted to accentuate that leverage. I wanted to bring some vivid illustrations of how life could be more affordable for Americans if we had a tariff-free pact between our two countries. And I think when you have Americans on side, the politicians will soon follow.
So your audience is Americans generally, but I imagine you want to convey this to the President of the United States, who's been pushing for tariffs not just with Canada, but countries around the world. Do you think that message can be resonant with him based on what you know of how he approaches trade?
Yes, because what the president really wants is to repatriate production and jobs to America. And I understand his argument that American jobs have been outsourced to places like China. There are literally cases of American factories closing so that Chinese factories can open. That doesn't happen with Canada. Our role in the American economy is to supply the goods for production. 70% of what we sell you is not for final consumption, but it goes into your production supply chain. So, give you an example. We sell about $100 billion of oil at huge price discounts, by the way. $100 billion, which you turn into $350 billion of final sales. So that means that the refinery worker in Baytown, Texas, is taking heavy crude from Canada and converting it into asphalt and jet fuel and other things like that, earning six-figure jobs. These are like the blue-collar, hardworking American people who the president wants to have bigger paychecks. Well, buying more Canadian goods will allow that. Buying more Canadian lumber will allow your youth to afford homes and your carpenters to swing more hammers. Buying more Canadian aluminum will allow your automakers to produce more F-Series Ford pickup trucks at lower prices to your consumers. So if the president's objective is more American-based production, importing the materials for that production from a reliable neighbor at good prices is part of that plan.
I want to have you draw a contrast between your view of Canada and the world and the Prime Minister's view of Canada and the world vis-a-vis the United States. So Prime Minister Carney went to Davos, delivered this speech, talked about a rupture, really an irreparable rupture, that Canada needed to move on because things had changed. Your outlook is markedly different from that. Spell that out for me.
So my outlook is that the United States is and American capitalism is the greatest economic force the world has ever seen. That's not my opinion. That's not an ideological point of view. That's just a mathematical fact. U.S. GDP far outstrips any other competitor. You have the biggest military the world has ever seen, and you're right next door. We sell twice as much to America as to the rest of the world combined. We sell 20 times more to America than we sell to China. Our interests are intertwined with the United States of America. We have to get this relationship back on track, and I believe that we can, because first and foremost, all of our interests on security, affordability, and economic growth are broadly aligned. Our peoples like each other. Our geography, as Kennedy said, our geography made us neighbors, history made us friends, economics made us partners, necessity made us allies. Those whom nature hath joined together, let no man put asunder. I believe that actually captures it. In simple terms, you can't hire a realtor and move your country away, and nor would we want to. I wouldn't want any other neighbor, and frankly, I don't think the Americans would rather have another neighbor than Canada. So let's get past the politics, fix the relationship, and let our countries go forward successfully.
So much of the rhetoric on the campaign trail from the Liberals was Mark Carney can confidently have these negotiations with President Trump. There wasn't a whole lot of that from you. So for those wondering what your tack would be compared to his, how would you approach those trade negotiations differently? What could you tell us just about the way that you would try to broker a deal with the U.S. in this moment?
Leverage. That's the key word. And we have a lot of leverage that we perhaps we don't realize what we have. We're America's second biggest customer. We are the #1 destination for exports from about 30 different states. We have in this, look at what's happening right now. Oil prices are up 60%. Americans are paying $5 a gallon in some parts of the country. We are the single biggest seller of oil to the United States of America. We sell 10 times more oil than your next biggest supplier, Mexico. And we have the ability to produce an extra 2 million barrels, which would be about 10% of your daily consumption, 2 million barrels a day. We can actually supply you with affordable energy. If you're that American guy who's at the pump today and you're overpaying, Canada could be part of the solution to that. And then you've got minerals. We've got 10 of the NATO-defined defense minerals that are necessary for modern warfare, whether it's cobalt for the alloys that go into jet engines, or it's germanium for night vision technology, or we've got aluminum, which you need for armored vehicles and aircraft. The list goes on. We should build up a massive strategic reserve of that and avail it to those allies that sign on to us in free trade agreements. The Americans would obviously be on our side, I would presume, in a future conflict. And in that case, if we have built up a massive reserve of both energy and minerals, and we've signed on to an agreement that allows preferred access to that, then Americans would benefit. Now, to get that, what do we want in return? Tariff-free trade. We want the tariffs gone on our aluminum, steel, autos, lumber. So simply put, build up leverage using our strengths, use that leverage to get tariff-free trade.
It's 9 a.m. in New York. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, President Trump's ultimatum to Iran: open the Strait of Hormuz, where the United States will strike power plants. The timeline and how Iran is responding.
And a $200 billion request to Congress.
It takes money to kill bad guys.
But a lot of Republicans have questions about that price tag. We'll talk to one of them, and a Democrat on the Appropriations Committee.
And breaking news, President Trump now says ICE will be at American airports while accusing Democrats of endangering the U.S. over Homeland Security funding. What your morning airport commute could look like as security delays plague travelers. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from our headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We've got some newsmakers coming your way this hour, as well as a political panel with a lot of folks here in studio, which will be nice for a big chat to wrap it all up at the end of your day. But first, we want to get right to it with Lisa with the headlines.
You got it. And President Donald Trump says ICE agents will be going to U.S. airports starting tomorrow. It was in a post in social media this morning. The president said it's to help TSA workers who have, quote, stayed on the job despite the fact that the radical left Democrats, who are only focused on protecting hardline criminals who have entered our country illegally, are endangering the USA by holding back the money that was long agreed to with signed and sealed contracts and all. Now this all comes. TSA TSA workers. They've been out without pay for 5 weeks. That's due to the partial government shutdown, pushing some to call in sick. That's led to those long delays. Major airports during the busy spring break season. Lawmakers have been battling it out over the weekend. Now, aside from the TSA, President Trump also busy posting about the war in Iran, giving Tehran a 2-day deadline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz or have its power plants bombed. It was a post on social media yesterday, 7:44 p.m. Eastern time. He said Iran has 48 hours to fully open the waterway without threat. If not, he said the U.S. would, quote, hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Now, Iranian media reports Tehran will strike U.S. infrastructure in the region if its plants are hit. The conflict has resulted in over 4,000 deaths, a surge in oil and natural gas prices. More than 150 people were injured in Israel Saturday by multiple Iranian strikes on the country's south, and that's as Tehran retaliated for an attack on its own nuclear facility. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said the joint campaign would intensify significantly a day after Tehran launched ballistic missiles at the U.S.-UK military base in Diego Garcia. And former FBI Director and Special Counsel Robert Mueller has died at the age of 81. Mueller oversaw the landmark investigation into alleged ties between the Russian government and President Trump's 2016 campaign. The president, posting on social media just minutes after the passing was announced, he said, quote, Robert Mueller just died. Good. I'm glad he's dead. He can no longer hurt innocent people. Of course, David and Christina, the president's response drawing criticism not only from Democrats, but Republicans as well.
Lisa, thank you very much. Always challenging to be a parent, challenging to explain something like that to kids, as I had to yesterday. They've been here before, though, with comments like that one before. Anyways,
I mean, the other thing people forget about Mueller, because we're so familiar with him for the Russia investigation, is he did also kind of reinvent the FBI after 9/11. He made it more possible for them to coordinate with the CIA to confront domestic threats.
Somebody with a long career both in public service and the private sector. Again, he passed away yesterday.
All right, the U.S. Congress is holding a rare weekend session as they continue to negotiate a funding package for DHS, as TSA goes into their 5th week without pay.
Trump has taken to social media saying that ICE will be at American airports while accusing Democrats of endangering the U.S. over Homeland Security funding. Joining us now is Maryland Congressman Glenn Ivey. He's a member of the House Appropriations and Ethics Committees. Congressman Ivey, thank you very much for being here. And let's start with the goings-on Capitol Hill this weekend. We're looking for any signs of progress here as we've seen this standoff between Republicans and Democrats on this funding issue. Do you see any signs of movement here, any progress, as we have the president indicating that ICE is going to be at American airports on Monday morning?
Yeah, I'm not sure that threat is helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that ICE isn't trained to do it. But two, I think we've got the possibility of actually paying TSA, getting a bill passed that would fix that issue and put the funding forward there. There's two options. The Democrats have offered an option. If we can't work something out with respect to ICE, let's just pass a bill that pays everybody else. And I've also seen the Republicans put on the table some agreement potentially to some of the demands that Democrats have made with respect to reforming ICE, although they left off the judicial warrants part. The one thing that the Constitution actually requires, they didn't have in the version that I saw. But I think there's a chance to fix this. Sending ICE to the airports, if he wants to do it, fine. If he doesn't, fine. I think the biggest way to fix this, though, is just to pass the legislation to pay them.
Is there any fear, during the last shutdown, Democrats stood on principle and basically lost. I mean, had to give in, or some members of the party gave in, and then it was seen as a political loss. Is there any concern that history might repeat itself here, especially as if the situation at airports get worse and the American public really starts to make noise about how this is impacting their daily lives?
Well, first of all, let me disagree that it was a loss. I didn't agree with my Senate colleagues who agreed to move forward without getting the actual adjustment for the ACA tax credits. But I think Democrats in the House certainly made the point, and Americans who had their premiums double and triple or quadruple fully understand now that it's totally on the Republicans. Trump and Republicans in Congress refuse to do any kind of extension, even a short-term one, try and figure out a way to keep their premiums from jumping. Those Americans, and there's millions of them, are paying the price for that now. With respect to the ICE issue, I think it's kind of the same thing. ICE had been solidified in the public mind as a major problem with respect to the Trump administration. They wanted the border closed down, but they didn't want people getting shot in the face and, killed for exercising their First Amendment rights. And They didn't like people getting dragged out of their cars and windshields shattered and teacher aides and gardeners and waitresses getting arrested. They didn't want any of that stuff. And I think we saw that in Minnesota. So I think at the end of the day, we were going to make sure we hold on and get as many of these issues addressed with respect to ICE, because they're out of control and people are dying they died on the streets, and they're dying in custody in some ways because ICE is not trained to do what they're doing right now, and it shows.
Let's shift our focus here to the war, the ongoing war in the Middle East. And we've seen the Pentagon indicate that they're going to request $200 billion for this war. That number could shift a little bit, but still an extraordinary amount of money, about a third of the Pentagon's budget, the equivalent of that. I'm curious what your appetite is for a request like that, how you think that's going to go down on Capitol Hill. I did note that Senator John Kennedy noted he would not go along with that without some more hearings on strategy in the course of this war. How is this resonating around the other House of Congress, around the House of Representatives?
I mean, I've got zero appetite for that. $200 billion, and the fact that he's got Marines heading over there right now strongly suggests he's looking at putting boots on the ground. And instead of trying to wrap this up quickly, is looking at the long-term type of quagmire that I think we all want to avoid. So I have zero interest in that. And $200 billion, you're right, that's a whole lot of money, and could have funded, for example, the ACA tax credit extension we were just talking about a moment ago, and some of the other major issues with respect to SNAP benefits and the like. So I think it's way off track. I think it's a number that doesn't make any sense, especially given some of the stated goals. They haven't actually landed on what the mission is. And I think they need to come back to Congress if they really want to have an extended war. Let's have the War Powers Act debate, and let's have a real one this time and have an actual vote to see if the American people really have an appetite for that. So far, they don't. And they've made no effort, Trump administration's made no effort to persuade the American people. And that's showing. And as the gas prices get higher, the American people are going to get even less appetite for this.
Congressman, I want to ask you about war powers, because even if Republicans and Democrats agree that they didn't want the president to go forward anymore with this military mission, realistically, is there anything Congress can do to stop the president if he wants to launch a war in Iran or Cuba or anywhere else he decides?
Well, funding is a big part. We control the power of the purse, and that's what the $200 billion request is about. And public opinion is another big piece, too. I think he's really swimming upstream on this one from a public opinion standpoint. The gas prices in my area were about $2.95 or so like a month ago. Now they're getting almost to $4. And, you layer that on top of the increasing in high prices for groceries due to the tariffs he's put on top of that, the healthcare credits expiring, and we just talked about that a moment ago, electricity prices, the affordability crisis that's been spawned almost entirely by the Trump administration is really starting to wear on the American people and undermine. His MAGA base is fine, but the independents are the ones that are going to drive the midterm elections. And he's way underwater with them, and the Republican Party is increasingly too. So I think you might start seeing some defections from Republicans in Congress because they're going to be worried about getting reelected in November.
Last question I have for you about the war centers on the way that we've seen it waged thus far. Yes, there have been a lot of kind of the legacy ballistic missiles that we've seen deployed in the past, but we've seen so many drones being used, so much emphasis on AI warfare going forward here. I know that's something of interest to you, research work that's being done in your district on AI and quantum computing. How well positioned is the U.S. to embark on this new kind of warfare as we've seen it play out, yes, in Iran, across the Middle East, but also in Ukraine as well?
To be frank, I think we've been caught a little flat-footed on this. The drone issue, if we'd been paying close attention to what's going on in Ukraine and the fact that Iran started supplying drones to Russia in the middle of that, we would have been doing more, I think, to upgrade our ability, not just to build drones and have them ready for ourselves, but for countermeasures. So right now, what we're looking at is drone attacks by Iran, where their drones cost like $20,000 for very sophisticated ones. We're using anti-measures that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even $1 million each. So it's certainly not cost effective. And I think, we've missed the chance to try and have countermeasures that are more affordable and allow us to be more sustained in protecting ourselves and our allies. And I think that's showing right now. So hopefully we can turn the corner on that relatively quickly. And I think add in the efforts with respect to AI and quantum and the like, Trump administration's really attacked science and technology a lot in the United States, certainly the university and research level. We've got to turn that around. China's pushing engineers and scientists towards these projects by the thousands. We've been cutting back. We can't afford to do that if we're going to stay competitive with China.
All right, Congressman Glenn Ivey. He is on the House Appropriations Committee, Democrat from Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us this Sunday.
We're going to turn out to the other side of the aisle to see what's happening there. We spoke with Republican Congressman Greg Steube of Florida. He serves on the House Intelligence Committee. Let's take a listen. Congressman, thank you very much for being with us. And over the course of the weekend, we've been hearing kind of a variety of arguments for why the U.S. is at war with Iran. We've heard about the prospect of there may be more troops sent to the region, maybe some troops on the ground in Iran. I'm curious sort of what your sense is of where this conflict is going directionally and what questions you and your constituents have about what course this is going to take.
Yeah, I mean, the president's made it clear and the Pentagon's made it clear we've decimated their Navy. We continue to take out their ballistic missile sites. There was a launch last night. You know, the Iranians said back in February that their missile capability was only like 1,200 kilometers, and they launched a intermediate ballistic missile 4,000 kilometers to try to hit one of our UK-US bases. So obviously their capabilities they said they were having and what we thought they have much more than that. So at this point, obviously, the president and the administration want to secure the Strait of Hormuz as much as possible to be able to get back to normal shipping. He's sent A-10 Warthogs. He's sent Apaches. I think those ground troops that they're moving to the region, although not on the ground there, are there to secure the strait. That obviously is a focus now because you're seeing oil prices and energy prices increase because the tankers aren't able to get through that strait.
But the president has said the U.S. doesn't use the strait. We don't need it. So should the U.S. try to secure that strait?
Well, I think it's like a 20% of oil that goes through that comes to the United States. It's 80% of the world's oil that goes through there. So obviously, even though we can produce at home, that obviously impacts overall global oil rates and oil rates right here at home. We're seeing the price at the pump increase all across the country. So I think they want to get that back to normal. There's also a number of fertilizer that goes through there. Potash comes through that region, and there's a lot of fertilizer. So you're seeing impacts in the agricultural sector as well. So the president, and I think the administration wants, rightly so, to secure that as much as possible. I think the Japanese yesterday, when the prime minister was in town, agreed to help assist in securing that. I think once that happens, I think you'll see the economy kind of level back out once that there's able to move traffic through the strait.
You served in Iraq. You're an Army JAG. I'm curious what your experience in that conflict does to inform your sense of how this one is unfolding. Of course, there was a lot of complaint and concern about how that was lengthened and how there were so many different rationales delivered for it. How are you thinking about this conflict in the context of that one in which you served?
Well, I'm relieved in the fact that the administration and Hegseth and the president have been very clear that we're going in, accomplishing a mission, and we're getting out. We're going to take out their ballistic missile capability. We're going to take out their nuclear capability. And we had the intel hearing this week where I think they kind of got into some of that in the open hearing where the public was able to hear some of that. So I'm very positive about the fact that we're going to go in, accomplish the objective and the mission and get out, and we're not going to be there for an extended period of time. We haven't put boots on the ground there like we did in Iraq in the early time in the surge. I served there from 06 to 07, which was one of the more violent times to be there. I don't want to see our troops on the ground in the country. I think having troops in the region to be able to secure the strait, I think, is very important. But we've already shown very quickly that we can go in with both air power and naval power and destroy the things that we need to destroy without putting boots on the ground.
I want to follow up on that because the president, there have been reporting the president is considering or has asked for plans to possibly take Karg Island. That may or may not require boots on the ground. If the president wanted to do that and it required a U.S. military presence on that island, would you support that?
Yeah, that island is pretty strategic because it's right there by the strait, and the Iranians have a number of different assets there that allows them to put mines and those boats they use. So I could see a limited deployment just to that island to ensure that the Iranians can't continue to use that to harbor and harm the shipping through the strait. I think that would be a smart move if that was something that we did in a limited capacity. I think, again, we have the ability through our air power and our naval power to be able to push back on a lot of the capabilities that the Iranians have. I think we've destroyed a number of their ballistic missile capabilities. They still have more, which is why you're still seeing strategic targets. But I think a small, limited incursion to that island to ensure that the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, I think is a good approach, a limited approach, where we're ensuring that the international traffic that's going through there is secure as it's traveling through.
But as David mentioned, limited actions in the Middle East, especially when it comes to the U.S. trying to do limited actions in the Middle East, often drag on for years and sometimes decades. Is that not a concern?
I mean, I don't have that concern. You saw what happened in Venezuela. We went in, we got Maduro, and we got out, and we don't have assets there. And you're seeing a very positive improvement there in the country of Venezuela and the relationships that we've had. We had the Interior Secretary not too long ago. The Venezuelans are openly now selling their oil to us. It's a much different political and economic environment there than it was when Maduro was there. And there was a large group of people from the media that were saying we would be there forever and we would have troops on the ground. And none of that has happened. So I trust the president. I trust what's happening at the Pentagon and Hegseth to make this a limited campaign to go in and strike the strategic things that we need to strike, and then pull out and allow whatever is going to happen with the people of Iran to happen, whether it's a democracy or a republic that comes there after the leadership is taken out and they have the opportunity to have democracy there.
In the time we have left, I'd love to ask you about those hearings that were on Capitol Hill over the course of last week with DNI Gabbard and CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and a kind of thread through both of them was this issue of how imminent was the threat from Iran. Curious for your thoughts on that, but more so, there were some testy exchanges surrounding what DNI Gabbard said about who gets to make the determination of what is an imminent threat, and she said that's the president's purview. That's something that he can do, and I think there are a lot of former intel folks who said, look, that's dismissing the work of a rather large intelligence community. How did you read what she had to say? Is that something that raised any concerns for you?
Well, it didn't, and she's right. I mean, at the end of the day, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military and has the ability to determine whether we need to be defended or need to go kinetic and be aggressive to protect the homeland and protect our bases in the region, and that's a decision that the president ultimately gets to make. I think there was a lot of discussion in the hearing about this immediacy and how we kind of define that. There were a lot more of that discussion in the closed-door hearing that was classified in nature, and you heard several of them say when that question came up that there's more information that can be provided in a classified setting. Obviously, I can't go into that here, but I think we're seeing the ramifications of that just last night. People were saying that the Iranians themselves in February were saying that they didn't have any missiles that went over 1,000 kilometers, and they launched one last night, 4,000 kilometers, and thankfully it didn't hit our base. So obviously they have a lot more capabilities that, one, they have said, and two, that a lot of people in the world thought that they had the capabilities to do. Obviously, the president has all of that intelligence in real time and is able to make a determination based off a threat that he sees to our bases in the region and to our allies in the region.
Congressman, quickly before we let you go, Congress is bracing for a Pentagon request that could be as much as $200 billion to help fund this war. Any concerns about spiraling costs? Do you think that's going to pass? And do you and your colleagues support that?
For me, it's going to need to be offset by cuts in other places. We're $39 trillion in debt. We can't continue to keep spending and not go after the debt and the deficit spending. So for me, it's going to have to be offset some way, somehow. I think that there's a lot of conservative members like myself that are in a similar circumstance. There are some members, and I've heard the reporting yesterday where there's a couple of members that said they're absolutely not going to support that. So you're going to have a challenge on the floor because we have a 2-vote majority right now. Thomas Massey's going to be a no. If one more Republican is a no, then it's not going to go. If they try to do a rule on it, which I assume they would, and those members vote against the rule, we're not even going to get to a vote. I don't think you have 2/3 majority to be able to pass it. I don't believe, and I don't know this, but I wouldn't assume that the Democrats are going to support $200 billion for the Iranian war. Maybe there's a handful of them that would, but even if there's a handful of them, that's not going to get you over that 2/3 threshold. So that is going to be a challenge, getting something like that through the House, just by virtue of the fact that if you have 2 members on the Republican side that are down down on the rule, you're not passing a rule. And I don't believe, as we sit here today, that the Democrats would support a 2/3 suspension bill on something like that.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to talk to you and also look at that sunny backdrop behind you. We're a little bit jealous here in cold New York.
Yeah, come and join the rest of New Yorkers and everybody else in the great state of Florida.
And I'm still a little jealous of that nice warm weekend, although we did have a pretty nice day here yesterday.
Yes.
All right, we have a full court press, quite literally, for our political panel today. Joining us now is Politico reporter Jason Beeferman. Back with us are Bloomberg's White House reporter Skylar Woodhouse and Bloomberg's senior reporter Miles Miller. Miles, I want to start with you because border czar Tom Homan is on TV right now saying a couple things I want you to comment on. First of all, he says the airports, ICE could go to the airports as soon as tomorrow. He says there will. I'm being told will go to the airports as soon as tomorrow. There is a plan today, and they're going to execute it tomorrow. And then also, he's saying that ICE will not go into homes without judicial warrants.
You know, that will solve one of the issues that we had heard from Democrats, right? Democrats want judicial warrants in order for ICE to go into homes. That does not solve the issue of identification on ICE officers. It does not solve the issue of also wanting ICE officers and agents to not be in mass. So it's one piece of the two other things that Democrats need to get this bill done. But yeah, as you said, you know, this first came out from the president, 8:15 this morning on Truth Social, saying that the great Tom Homan is in charge and he will be making sure that ICE agents are at the airports. We talked about this in the first hour. What will this look like? Likely, you know, assisting TSA agents and making sure that you put your stuff in your bins all correctly, but they don't have training for this. So it'll probably be in a support role more than anything. But then the added layer of ICE agents at airports means that they'll also be looking for people in the country illegally.
Right, which they said.
Very, you know, it's something that doesn't happen often. And so it'll be interesting to see how this all comes together.
Skylar, pick up on what Miles was talking about there. That is the president's reliance on Tom Homan. We saw that in Minnesota as well. And I'm curious sort of your reaction to that, him being deployed in this circumstance as well, but also just the president's engagement with this story. So it's been a standoff that's taken more than a month now between Republicans and Democrats. Like many legislative battles, he has kind of kept a safe remove or a fair distance from the goings-on in Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, Homan he's been around for a very long time, and he's sort of viewed as, you know, the adult that gets brought in when things might start to be going crazy. And we saw that with what was going on in Minnesota before Kristi Noem was ousted as the Homeland Security Secretary. Homan came in and sort of tried to calm the temperature. So, I mean, look, it'll be interesting to see how things go. I mean, I think it's very interesting that with ICE right now, there's obviously a lot of distrust, and what we saw in Minnesota, the way the tensions quickly just grew, and obviously TSA agents are sort of viewed as being friendly, even though they'll yell at you to take your shoes off or I guess put your stuff in the right bins.
Tell you to,
but they're viewed as sort of, you know, more friendly law enforcement agents. And so obviously...
Depends on how late you are for your flight, but
that's also true, yeah. But I mean, so it'll be interesting to see how the relationship between now bringing ICE in does with TSA, and maybe it'll bring some calm, but it could also just cause more disruption.
Jason, I want to ask you about the optics of this ahead of the midterms, because as we were just talking about, one of the things that still hasn't been settled is when ICE is out on its immigration work, whether or not they will be covering their faces, whether or not they will be in a standard uniform. These are things Democrats want, and Republicans have not come to the table. What are these guys going to be wearing at the airports? What are they going to be looking at? And there are already, some people like TSA, some people don't. There's already a tendency to film TSA when you're mad at them. I just feel like the presence of ICE agents is not going to help anybody's stress level at the airport. But is this a good idea before the midterms?
I think you raise a lot of questions that everyone's asking, right? We didn't even know until maybe 10, 20 minutes ago that they really were going to show up on Monday. It's clear that, you know, Democrats want change. They want real accountability for the ICE officers. But Republicans have this leverage in this shutdown where they can create these long lines at the TSA and they can kind of force their hands. And we'll see if there's going to be any capitulations, any concessions, and what deal kind of gets made. But if anything, you know, I think putting ICE officers in the airports draws more attention to the chaos that's going on. Maybe it will speed up these lines. We really don't know, as we're really, you know, flying by the seat of our pants, I think.
Miles, I'm curious kind of who's running the show at DHS at this point. We've talked about Tom Homan, Mark Wayne Mullin yet to be confirmed, Christina on a new adventure in a newly created job for her. At this moment, when it comes to border security, when it comes to security of the homeland, who is in charge? Who's calling the shots?
Yeah, I think when President Trump wrote on Truth Social this morning that the great Tom Homan is in charge, that's what he meant, is that he's in charge of this operation and he's also in charge of the issues in the homeland. I think, it's going to still take some time for Mark Wayne Mullin to get in his seat. And Christina has already picked her people who she's taking with her to the State Department. And so Tom Homan's keeping the wheels on the train, which is, if you are, a longtime follower of politics and government, it's not a bad thing given his experience at ICE and being, a career ICE official.
I think our controller was just saying they do have some sound from Tom Homan from his appearance this morning, so we're going to play that for you guys.
How is that going to work? Are ICE agents going to move into American airports starting tomorrow, Monday?
Yes. And I'm currently working on the plan now of execution, working with the director of ICE and the administrator at TSA, the acting administrator. So we'll put together a plan today and we'll execute tomorrow.
Is this something the White House has capacity to do right now? The president is sounding a little bit tired. He's got a couple fronts, more than a couple fronts going. There's a war in Iran. There's problems at home. There's a midterm coming up. Is this a fight that the president didn't need to pick, or does he think he's solving one of these problems that is taking so much of his time?
Well, President Trump, one thing you could say he's excellent at doing is shifting the narrative. Obviously, what we saw with Iran and his new 48-hour window.
Right, he's told Iran they've got 48 hours to clear the strait, or he's going to start striking energy infrastructure.
So now and that was a pretty harsh threat. And now, obviously, lots of questions being raised there. So for him to wake up, I know this was talked about yesterday with bringing these agents to the airports, but he's got a lot going on. So he's going to move the needle when one thing is starting to maybe unravel and not
go the way he wants,
pan out the way he would like. So he's now going to focus on ICE agents going into airports and talking about how this is, the Democrats' fault. So he likes to move the messaging because he wants to wave, something shiny here to deflect from something that's going on over there. So it'll be interesting to see. But he's got a lot going on. I mean, he's multitasking like no other. But
as presidents must.
We'll see what comes tomorrow.
Multitasking, Jason, perhaps vacillating as well. Let's talk about what he's kind of moving attention away from. This 48-hour deadline is designed to keep people, I guess, from worrying about the fact that that strait has been closed, remains closed. A lot of analysts saying it could be closed for a very long time. Some investment banks talking about the prospect of $200 a barrel oil. This is a critical issue and one that will become more and more critical as we approach the midterm elections, and I think certainly is front of mind for a lot of lawmakers.
If you remember when President Trump was elected, that was the #1 issue, the pocketbook issues. If you remember, I remember going to the gas station, seeing those stickers of Joe Biden pointing at the price and saying, I did that. And here we're in a similar situation where gas prices are skyrocketing. Voters are going to the polls. But you know what? I'd be interested. Democrats are already confident now. How long will this last? I've seen some reports these high gas prices could last until 2027. Now we're talking about potentially impacting the presidential election, certainly the primaries. So it seems like we're kind of in that similar situation where pocketbook stuff is top of mind, and Democrats are quite cynically probably feeling really good about all the strife that's going on.
Miles, when it comes to these really high oil prices, we've heard the president say, we don't use the Strait of Hormuz, so it's fine. We'd like it open, but it doesn't really impact us. But it does impact prices regardless. And one of the things people are now talking about is how catastrophic it would be if Iran were to hit something outside the region, if they hit an oil facility in Europe or in the U.S. Given all the turmoil, all the turnover that's happened at these U.S. domestic agencies, I'm thinking the FBI and DHS, give us your assessment of whether the national security apparatus is able to meet and monitor potential threats to the homeland.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about the intelligence community, but also Homeland Security, is that it's not just focused on Washington, but you've got the states, the 50 states in this country that are working in fusion centers to make sure that they're checking for threats. And that's the one thing, is that while it seems like the wheels have come off the train in some parts of Washington, 9/11, you still have the career people, in addition to having, local governments that are working on making sure that they're protecting against threats. One of the threats right now looks like drone threats. Could there be the potential of some kind of drone threat within the interior United States? We have just finally gotten approval in this city and in cities across the country to be able to mitigate that kind of threat. So
previously you couldn't shoot it down?
You could not shoot a drone down. No, you could not. And that has now recently been changed. So it's about how local governments are working with the federal government to get this kind of stuff done. But it's also, none of this stuff really happens at the top leadership level. They're having the conversations with career officials to make sure that this heightened threat posture continues to be followed and that threats are continued to be looked into.
Miles, I'd love to end by talking about Robert Mueller, who passed away on the 20th, I believe, and the president has marked that, I should say, celebrated the death of him yesterday in this tweet. I don't know if we can put it up once again. But get us up to speed here on the legacy that he leaves, not the legacy as defined by President Trump here, although it certainly is one that intersects with Donald Trump's presidency and the period thereafter. He, as Christina pointed out a while ago, hugely instrumental in reforming the Federal Bureau of Investigation after 9/11. Talk a bit about the work that he did over the years leading up to, of course, the Russia investigation.
You think about what happened on 9/11 and, the steps that this country took to increase their threat posture after 9/11. You started to learn about threat levels in the country. You started to learn about lone wolf terror and homegrown terror. And all of that is directly attributed to the way that he rebuilt the agency. There were FBI agents who were killed on 9/11. If you remember, the Secret Service's office was in the World Trade Center. What happened there was a good amount of intelligence was lost during that attack, but so much was learned. We started to learn about the FBI most wanted list. We started to learn about the inner workings of Al-Qaeda, putting officers and agents around the country. That is his legacy. Of course, brought back as special counsel, but for good reason, because of the years of training and experience, but also the leaders that he was able to shape in the department moving forward. That's a legacy that is huge in the FBI, and to see those words yesterday, definitely, talking with agents and hearing from the FBI Agents Association, everybody was shocked and alarmed by what they saw.
Miles, thank you very much. That's Miles Miller. He's a senior reporter here at Bloomberg, covers law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security for us out of New York. Jason Beeferman of Politico joining us here on set in New York, and Skylar Woodhouse, who covers the White House for us at Bloomberg News up here in New York this weekend. Thank you very much.
And joined us all weekend.
Yes,
thanks, Skylar. We know you were here for fun, but we had fun having you on
yes.
set. So thank you so much.
As we continue to follow this story, which I think will be, we have all these questions, as Jason pointed out rightly when you asked yours, everyone in front of mine, what's this going to be like tomorrow at the airports? I think a lot of uncertainties. We hear the president and his borders are talking about the prospect of there being ICE agents at the airports.
I think so too.
Morning.
And look, the administration has argued they're highly trained security professionals. That's all true, but this is a very specific job. And just because you are good at things doesn't mean you're good at a very specific thing. So we'll have to see if it's helpful, if it's not, and how the traveling public react to it. So the crisis in Iran leading to higher gas prices and dragging down stocks. A look ahead to what we can expect when the markets open. It's Bloomberg This Weekend.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date with some of the top stories. And a top senior Cuban official is saying that the country is preparing for a possible military assault. Now, this person, Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Fernandez de Casio, he tells Meet the Press that Cuba's military is ready for that possibility of military aggression, but he does hope it does not happen. This all coming, of course, as President Trump increases that economic pressure on the government in Havana, also suggesting it could be the next U.S. target after Venezuela and Iran. From that, we take you to Elon Musk. He's also in the headlines this morning. His project to manufacture chips will be built in Austin and run by Tesla and SpaceX. That's what he's posting about this morning, the TerraFab project. It's his plan to eventually make his own chips for robotics, artificial intelligence, and space data centers. Musk has said the semiconductor industry, it's moving too slow to keep up with the supply of chips he thinks he needs. And we were through the first round of the NCAA tournament. 8 teams booked a spot in the Sweet 16 on Saturday, including 4 from the Big Ten. One of the upsets, that was Texas, beating Gonzaga 74-68. 2 number 1 seeds move on to the next round. You have Michigan beating St. Louis 95-72, and Duke topping TCU 81-58.
Christina, we shed a tear for you.
I thought they had it for a minute. They were up like for a little bit, and then it
the
just
horned toads.
Yeah. Excuse me. It is a horned frog. You go like this.
Yes.
This is the mascot. I knew you guys would give me a hard time about this.
So you watched.
I definitely watched the game. I especially enjoyed when Cameron Boozer exploded for 17 points, leading Duke to the Sweet 16. For our radio listeners, I am definitely not reading that off a sheet of paper.
Your mascot was really incredible looking.
It's a big
It's
thing.
like out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, it's like a souped up frog that stands on its hind legs, but the auditions for that are intense.
I believe
like
it.
you have to do flips, you have to do all this stuff, and then they don't reveal who it is until like the end of the year.
And it was you, wasn't it?
It was not
It was
me.
Oh, sorry.
Are you kidding me? I had a double major, 2 jobs in no time. It was not me. It was not me.
That TCU update brought to you by, I don't know. All
Our
right.
chief TCU correspondent. That's what I'm here for
Yes.
on a Sunday.
The Bob Schieffer chair. We can call it.
100%.
All right. U.S. equities coming off their 4th straight week of declines. I saw the S&P 500 has been down 5.5% since the start of the conflict in the Middle East.
Here now, we've got Stuart Paul. He's Bloomberg Economics U.S. and Canada economist. All right, as we look ahead of markets opening on Monday, what are you expecting? What should we be on the lookout for? What are you worried about?
Well, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of escalating rhetoric, especially talking about putting boots on the ground or any sort of additional military action to take Karg Island. Any sort of escalation in the near term is obviously posing downside risk for equity markets and upside for rates. And when it comes to the economic consequences of this escalating military conflict in the Middle East, the numbers are pretty clear. It should end up ultimately shaving about 1 percentage point off the annualized pace of household spending growth and materially denting GDP growth. From the Fed's perspective, they're mostly reading through it for now.
Stuart, help us understand the difficulty of forecasting in this environment. We heard from the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, some rhetoric about trying to look through this massive geopolitical event. I think more astonishing still was him acknowledging they're not prepared to do anything with this until they kind of get inflation down more broadly. As you look at what's transpired, as you think about that duration variable, how do you game out anything in this environment, in this scenario?
It's tricky. So the first thing to do is really to start at the most basic level, from my perspective, which is really the household level. And what we've seen so far is about a 32% increase in gasoline prices. And so what does that mean for everyday consumers? Well, it means that they're going to have to increase the dollars that they're laying out for gasoline, tighten their belts elsewhere. And what is that going to mean for retail sales? Well, an additional about $12 billion a month spent on gasoline. And most of that is going to come from real spending on other goods and services. And so what does that end up doing? It shaves about 0.7 percentage points off of monthly retail spending in real terms. And again, it's going to end up denting real consumer spending growth when it goes into GDP. When we think about what that then means for policy making, there are the 2 elements here. The mechanical increase in gasoline prices as a consequence of higher global energy prices, and then there's the downside growth risk that we should see materializing through time. The Fed is very much so focused on just sort of keeping their foot on the brake, not cutting even despite any sort of softness in the labor market or despite any sort of downside growth risk. They're basically just signaling a dedication to the 2% inflation target despite, again, that mechanical increase in inflation because of higher global energy prices.
We're talking about consumer confidence, but there's also investor confidence, producer confidence, and the confidence of these companies to put this material back on the water. We heard the Israeli defense minister today say we're about halfway through this conflict. That could be 2 to 4 more weeks. This is not an on-off switch. That's 2 to 4 more weeks until people could even think about business as normal. What is the actual tail end timeline likely to be? And do you see business as normal in the next 6 months even, as people are likely concerned to invest in this region?
Well, so it seems as though the business as usual that we should be banking on is really investment in IT, semiconductor manufacturing, and onshoring of certain production separate and apart from bringing additional energy infrastructure online. For the U.S. economy and for the U.S. growth outlook, the investment capacity that folks are hoping will drive growth throughout 2026 and 2027 should mostly be untainted by any sort of...
Isn't energy such a huge part of the AI conversation?
It is a big part of the AI conversation, but not so much oil. It really depends on how much gas we end up keeping domestically to fuel power production in the United States and to support any sort of data centers. But the additional investment that we're expecting to drive growth throughout 26 and 27 should continue mostly apace if we see any sort of peaking of the escalation of the war and an ultimate wind down over even just 4 to 6 months. That investment should continue pace. If we see it much beyond that, then real consumer belt tightening will start bleeding through the investment outlook, and we'll really start seeing the growth outlook deteriorating.
I want to kind of linger on this locus of the soft data, the sentiment data, and the hard data. And Ben Castleman in the New York Times wrote this great piece about how we've seen this economy behave so resiliently over these last few years. We heard the Fed chair talk about that in the press conference as well. But what Ben pointed out, and I think is so interesting, is that kind of belies what we're seeing at the consumer level. There's a lot of frustration with this economy. There's a lot of fear about where things are headed. What do you make of that disconnect, and what does it tell you kind of notionally about the trajectory of the economy when you have that kind of disconnect?
What matters most to me are the aggregates. I don't worry so much about soft data like sentiment, because ultimately what matters for companies is seeing growing revenues. What matters for companies are their margins, and what matters for policymakers are the economic aggregates like inflation, GDP growth, and the unemployment level, separate and apart from what people feel when they respond to surveys. I don't want to downplay the political consequences, for example, of negative sentiment as a consequence of higher energy prices and folks feeling as though they're stretched. There are certainly political consequences that will feed into economic conditions down the road. But what matters most for me, what will matter most for investors, are going to be those hard data.
We've talked a lot about interest rates. The market is now kind of expecting no movement there, no rate cuts. But we heard from Jerome Powell yesterday at an event. We want to play you that sound.
Independence and integrity are inseparable. We need independence to do what is right. We need integrity to use that independence wisely. Ultimately, each of us will want to look back at the arc of our lives and know that what we did was the right thing.
Powell's term ends in May. There is still an appeal for this investigation. Even other Republicans are trying to encourage the administration, for the sake of the markets, to just let it go, move on, have some continuity. What's your take on where all this goes and how the markets are going to react?
I think markets have been way underestimating the probability that this investigation remains ongoing. Really? It's very difficult for the DOJ to back down from this without revealing what markets know to be true, that this is mostly intended to put political pressure on the Fed to sway policy. For the DOJ to back down would just reveal that truth. So it's a difficult thing to acknowledge. In that case, we just have more of the status quo, which is Chairman Powell staying in his role as both FOMC chair and chair pro tem of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. And I could see that lasting through the end of the year, frankly. And I think that most people are completely ignoring that possibility.
Stuart, great to have you with us. Thank you for coming in. That's Stuart Paul, a U.S. and Canada economist at Bloomberg Economics. And Christina, picking up on your point, I mean, I think that this has been fascinating to watch. We had the Fed chair addressing this issue of how long he'll stay in the position. Seemingly will have to here if there isn't a successor confirmed. But then, of course, chairing the FOMC, being a Board of Governors member going forward, still some outstanding questions.
We've talked a lot about this administration's competing priorities and policies. I think this is another good example of what they want and how they're pursuing it, and whether or not those two things are running into each other. All right, coming up, what can Charles Dickens and Emily Bronte teach us about the AI revolution?
I'm intrigued.
Yes, I said that correctly. That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm David Gura. The AI transition may be faster, bigger, and more disruptive than the Industrial Revolution, Martha Gimbel writes. She's the director of the Yale Budget Lab. But if we want to have a flourishing economy and society on the other side, learning from what our predecessors went through is even more important this time around. And that is exactly what literature is there to help us do.
So in this week's forecast, Gimbel suggests a handful of novels from the 19th century that she says can help us navigate technology changes in the 21st century. And she's joining us now. Martha, thank you so much for being here. First of all, what are your thoughts? How much do we know about how much AI is going to disrupt the labor market, economy, and society?
We really have no idea, right? You have a range of predictions out there, but at this point, we're all just guessing. And so I think rather than all of us sitting in our offices and pontificate and trying to figure this out better than the next person, it's really useful to kind of take a step back and think about where we've been.
Before we get to your recommendations, the books that you recommend, what broadly can history tell us about the moment that we're in right now? We're constantly bombarded with people saying this is novel terrain. AI is going to be even more revolutionary than anything we've experienced in the past. How much does history offer good counsel?
I think the thing that we really learn from history, right, is that no matter what the size of the disruption, no matter how quickly it happens, it's disruptive. And there are people who benefit and there are people who suffer. And society has to figure out how to deal with it. We haven't yet had a technological revolution where society as a whole wasn't better off at the end of it. But that doesn't mean that that was true for everyone. And that doesn't mean that people were better off immediately. The transitions are hard and a lot of people suffer during them.
Yeah, in this article, you say you're grateful for the Industrial Revolution, but you wouldn't have wanted to live through it. This is not encouraging for this moment that we're in right now. So what are the lessons from the past on how to endure changes of times of upheaval like this?
I mean, I think one of the things and the themes that you see coming up repeatedly in literature and in discussions at the time is kind of what is society's and the individual's responsibility in a time of change? You can be someone who is just thinking about what this means for you and trying to navigate it that way. But the people who hold on and the people who do the best are the ones who are thinking about what this means for, in the 19th century, their village, but their broader community and how they fit in as part of that.
Let's tick through these, starting with a book by Elizabeth Gaskell. Why is North and South one that you've recommended?
So North and South is sort of the usual Industrial Revolution novel that everyone goes to. I should say it's one of my favorites. But one of the great things about North and South is it's about a woman who moves north from the south of England, who is really not familiar with what is going on from an industrial perspective. She's moving from a more agricultural environment. She herself is not economically affected by what's going on, but because she is a neutral observer, she can kind of see how things are changing and, how the new capitalists are interacting with their workers. What's the new sort of power and agency that workers were feeling at the time, and how that gets really complicated. And she has to figure out what's good from the new version of the economy that she wants to bring into her life and what she wants to hold on to from the old.
We also have Shirley by Charlotte Bronte and A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And we were speaking before in the break. I am a longtime Dickens hater, and you said you're not a fan of the Brontes, but you put them on your list. Why?
I did. I have to admit, I'm not a Brontes person. They can be very emotion heavy, for lack of a better phrasing. But I think the thing that's really interesting about Shirley is it is fundamentally about a textile mill owner trying to figure out how to navigate the new moment. And he's trying to figure out, what is his responsibility from an economics perspective, but also still being there for his workers, for people in his community. But also one of the things I think is really interesting in Shirley is it talks about the role that the Napoleonic Wars and the export restrictions played in what happened. And that made a huge difference in the path of the Industrial Revolution for people. And it's really interesting to see him kind of work that throughout the book.
In that moment of the Industrial Revolution, there were the Luddites, those who were pushing back so actively against this kind of technological progress. What can we learn from them as they were featured in many of these books?
I think one thing that you've seen in these conversations about AI is sometimes you hear people saying, this is new, this has never happened to high-paid workers before, workers who do prestigious work. And I think the unfortunate thing for many white-collar workers to realize is the weavers were the white-collar workers of their day. If you read about their lives, they had flexible work schedules. Sometimes they decided to take the day off and work from Brighton. It sounds similar.
Because it was portable, right? They could go anywhere. They could be outside, they could be inside, and that all changed.
Right. And they had control over their hours. Some of them only worked 4 days a week. I mean, again, as I'm talking, I think to a lot of people, this is going to sound somewhat familiar. And then all of a sudden, there was this huge hit that they didn't see coming. And they had to adjust. And unfortunately, that adjustment did not go well for most of them.
All right, Martha Gimbel, thank you so much. I will try to take inspiration and stop being a Luddite when it comes to AI. But we really appreciate your perspective. You can read more about this story and get a jump start on your week ahead with the Forecast newsletter. Subscribe at Bloomberg.com/newsletters. Thanks once again to Martha for joining us earlier this week.
That's
and
great.
Thanks to you for joining us here on Bloomberg This Weekend. Please join our colleagues in Asia this evening when global markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow for an exclusive interview with Fed Governor Stephen Mullin. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. We'll be back with you Saturday at 7 o'clock Eastern Time for our audience on Bloomberg Television. The Shah Hussein Show starts right now.